There's nothing more awkward than a silent auditorium. Hi.
You should sing. Sing for us.
Sing for us?
Sing something.
Why don't you cook something? Give us some science, Richard. All right. Well, hi. I'm Carl Franklin.
And I'm Richard Morris.
And I'm Carrie Brown.
And welcome to the 3rd annual Ketofest. We're trying to figure out the technology here. Are you going to do it or do you want me to? Okay.
So before we get started, there's a few people in the audience that we'd like to recognize.
Yes. Go ahead.
Firstly, our A team of organizers, Daisy Brackenhall, stand up. And Karen Jones, if you're here, stand up. I can't see her.
She's probably outside organizing.
And Elise Mullins, if you're here, stand up. So, huge thank you, because none of this would have happened without those 3 ladies.
That's right. Daisy organized all of the food, the cooking demos, and the tastings. Whoops. Wrong way.
Karen Jones organised all the volunteers who did everything from setting up tables and chairs to cooking at RD86 to driving to the store just to get more water bottles.
And Elise Mullins organised all of the vendors, designed the layout of the tent on the parade, and dealt with all the rental companies to make a seamless experience for all of us.
Yes. Next, I'd personally like to thank Mayor Mike Passero. Is Mike here? Stand up, Mayor. There he is, right there. Mayor of New London. In 2017, I went into his office and told him about this crazy idea I had about this absolutely ridiculous diet that I used to heal myself. And he said to me, I remember, he says, you know, anything that you can do to reduce the number of ambulance rides to the emergency room, which the town has to pay for, helps us, and it helps them. So I'm behind you 100%. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
And he's attended every Ketofest as well.
Yes, yes.
We'd also like to thank Steve and Jeannie Siegel from the Guard Theatre, who both have had their own successes with the ketogenic diet. We're very lucky to be in this wonderful auditorium today, and we thank them very much.
It's beautiful.
And lest we forget, Chef Robert Ramsey and the team at RD86, who helped turn Carl's house into a 5-star restaurant, spent hours prepping and running large quantities of food, and taught all of us how to work in a professional production kitchen.
Yeah. And then there is an army of staff and volunteers who gave their time to this thing last week to make Ketofest a success. And we can't remember them all, so we have to read them from the program, but we'd like to personally recognize them right now. Andrew Cootermarsh.
Annalie Fowler.
Barbara Schimmer.
Yes. Barry Fullerton.
And Becky Caldwell.
Bill Notek.
Cecile Seth.
Cynthia Karkoska.
Cynthia Lockington.
Dale Arnett.
Dave Brooks.
Ellen Brooks.
Dave Michelle.
Dawn Michelle.
Oh, sorry, Dawn Michelle. Sorry, Dawn.
Deb Pelly.
Heidi Zabel.
Janet Stanchik.
Jennifer Rooney.
Kent Fuge.
Julie LaPlante.
Jill McMahon.
Karen Ogilvie.
Laura Blynew.
Laura Seth.
Lindsay Silcox.
Melinda Barati.
Marcy Arnott.
Mark Rhodes.
Nikisha Little.
Paul Littlefield.
Robin Ramirez.
Rochelle Sitram.
Sam Jam.
Sandy Smith.
Seth Garden.
Sharon Merriman.
Sheila Smith.
Ted Cool.
Terry Lance.
And Tracy Edelman.
Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Oh, yeah. Well, A very special thanks to my wife, Kelly J. Franklin, who worked behind the scenes and tirelessly put up with me.
And she keeps reminding us she's Carl's boss.
That's right.
We also wanted to call special attention to the Nutrition Coalition. Nina Teicholz, who spoke at Ketofest last year, she is a big part of this organisation that is trying to change the US government's dietary guidelines.
Because if the US changes its recommendations as to what food we eat, the rest of the world will follow.
That's right.
So if you're looking for a place to put your dollars that can work toward changing the world, we feel the Nutrition Coalition is where it's at. Best bang for buck.
So let's talk about the themes of Ketofest past. On our first Ketofest was in 2017. That theme was Pay It Forward.
And we encouraged everyone there to save the lives of just 2 people by showing them the science of the ketogenic diet.
And the amazing food that they can eat.
It's impossible to thank the people who brought us to the ketogenic diet, but by paying it forward, by helping just 2 people and encouraging them to do the same, the geometric progression will guarantee that we can eventually reverse diabetes faster than the universe can produce new diabetics.
Yeah. It's worth applause.
Let's hear it for Ketofest 2017.
So last year, in 2018, the theme was Expand Your Community.
We were encouraging you to get more involved in your communities, both online and on terra firma.
There were many people in our circle of friends who decided to start up their own online communities and grow them.
By growing our communities, we can reach more people in a shorter period of time and hopefully save more lives faster.
And this year, our theme is...
To the moon and back. So yesterday was the 50th anniversary of Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon. And possibly the most poignant moment of the entire moon landing was when Mike Collins in Columbia said goodbye to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in the Eagle. And for 24 hours, he would be the most alone human that had ever existed.
He didn't know if Neil and Buzz would survive the ascent and landing, or the ascent and have to be abandoned on the moon. But they survived, and the 3 came home to tell the world of the perspective they had gained standing on the moon and looking back at our planet.
And this is like the moment when we first told our friends, family, and strangers about a ketogenic diet. Isn't it? Sound familiar, right? We knew the theory. We knew it worked for us. We had a hope and a trust that we could help our fellow humans.
We're talking about perspective.
Being able to see things from a completely different point of view than you ever thought that you could.
Think about it. Everyone you know, everyone who has ever existed from the moon is on that little ball. Click.
So how would you convey that kind of perspective to people who couldn't even imagine experiencing it?
Let's pretend that nobody knew that Neil, Buzz, and Michael had been to the moon. Imagine that TV wasn't a thing in 1969.
So, Neil here claims he went to the moon and came back. What a nut job.
But here's the thing. They actually did go to the moon.
Standing on that lifeless rock and looking at the Earth must have been both thrilling and terrifying at the same time.
Again, sound familiar? Thrilling and terrifying. Well, guess what?
We, all of us, are on the moon.
And now we have to go back home and try to convince our doctors and medical professionals that we have actually been there.
And we have the benefit of physical evidence. And yet, your doctor or medical professional might be looking for that one little clue that you're actually out of your mind.
Like higher than normal LDL levels.
Or, you're eating too much fat.
Heard that before? How about, you can't be healthy if you don't eat fresh fruit every day.
So let us all enjoy our moonwalk today.
But let's start thinking about how we are going to convey our new perspective to the medical community starting when we go home tonight.
Let us gently guide those who have influence over thousands of people's lives to the benefits of being in nutritional ketosis. Thank you.
So just a few items to talk about for the day. Check out the inserts in your program for updates to the talks today.
At the closing session, we're going to be passing out evaluation forms and pens so that you can tell us how we did, good, bad, we want to hear it all.
And we'll, of course, be raffling off some good swag.
Including bacon, apparently.
Yeah, we hope. So thank you and have a great Science Sunday. We're going to bring our MC, Nick Mailer, up to take it from here. Thank you. Yeah, cool.
Thanks very much to the three keto dudes. We're going to keep a tight schedule today because we're all in one room and there's so much to get through, but it's nice that we're starting early. I have to tell you, though, that there is actually no such thing as ketosis. Beta-hydroxybutyrate was forged on a soundstage by Stanley Kubrick, so there you go. So we're going to start today, if Megan is ready, with Megan Ramos, and we're going to talk about intermittent fasting and lean mass. But before we do that, just to say that we are going to stick to our break times very strictly, and when the break time is over, we're going to begin the talks very much on schedule. Also, all the speakers have 30 minutes, and I think Carrie is going to pull you off the stage with a shepherd's hook if you go over that, so be careful. So if we're ready, we can bring up Megan now to begin setting up her talk about intermittent fasting and lean mass. Thank you.
Hit what? Huh? I'm escape. Oh, I am actually half deaf in one ear. Okay. It's cute. Just find me here. Do I do Brandon? F5. Okay. Sorry, everyone. Well, good morning, New London. I'm honored to be back here again. Actually, due to weird flight times to Toronto, this is my second time kicking off Science Sunday at Ketofest. So thank you for coming out to hear me talk about intermittent fasting. Not as fun as some of the feasting talks, but perhaps after feasting yesterday, you're eager to perhaps do a little bit of fasting today. So I'm going to talk about intermittent fasting and lean mass. So I think most of you have an idea who I am. So many of you have come up to me and shared your stories over the last couple of days, and it's been so great to hear from all of you. For those of you who don't know me, I founded this little organization with this goofy nephrologist named Dr. Jason Fung in Toronto. So we founded a program called Intensive Dietary Management, where we work with patients on when they eat and what they eat. And another disclosure that I'd like to share is that I am painfully biased because fasting and low carb reverse my health issues. So for those who don't know me, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I've been a metabolic mess my whole life. But in my earlier years, I was skinny fat. And unfortunately, that's something that doctors don't quite understand, or at least none of mine did. I had my first sign of metabolic syndrome was at the age of 12 with fatty liver, and it just snowballed till I became not skinny fat, but just plain fat in my 20s. I knew about the low carbohydrate diet. Around the same time, there was a lot of great stories coming out, social media, lots of great anecdotal evidence from colleagues of mine. But I ate like garbage my whole life, and it was such a struggle. And I also grew up in the fast food era with really busy parents, and I didn't know how to cook. Boiling water was my specialty in addition to ordering pizza. I know all of the Toronto pizza numbers off by heart. So overhauling my diet, it was a real struggle, and my goofy colleague who I started working with when I was 15 years old in the nephrology department said, "Why don't you just try not eating?" And he gave me all of this data on fasting and religion. And he said, take a look at it. And for me, at the time, it was just easier not to eat than to overhaul my lifestyle and figure out how to cook. I remember Jason looking at me one day and say, just cook with coconut oil. And I looked at him like a deer in headlights. Like, what do you do with that? So I just stopped eating. And I started to feel really good on the days that I didn't eat, which is a really great kick to start changing what I did eat, because I finally had a taste of what it felt like to feel good. So I started changing my diet, and within 6 months, I reversed all these years worth of metabolic syndrome. My results inspired our patients in the research department, it inspired our colleagues in the nephrology department, and they let us start fasting patients in June of 2012. So at our program, we focus on various fasting protocols. Really, when you eat and what you eat, we believe, is key for optimal health. So we do time-restricted eating, intermittent fasting. We do different variations of low-carb and ketogenic diets, depending on our patient's lifestyle. So today, I know there are some people that are very advanced fasters in this group and are eager to learn something new about fasting, something they haven't heard Jason or I say 100 times before. And I know there are some people who are brand new to fasting, aren't quite sure what it is or what the basic principles are. So today I'm going to try to cover a little bit for everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of fasting, what it is. I'll briefly discuss how it works. And we're going to dig into the relationship between fasting and lean mass, how we can fast and not entirely waste away, which is everyone's biggest concern with fasting, is that they're going to lose all their muscle mass and they're going to fall into this blob on the floor if they skip a meal. All right, so what is fasting? So a lot of people think fasting and starvation are the same thing, but they're actually not. Fasting, you're choosing to abstain from food for either health reasons or spiritual reasons, but it's your own choice. Food is readily available. You could have it if you want, but you're selecting to not consume it. Whereas starvation is involuntary. Food just isn't there. Even if you wanted it, it's just not there, and you don't know when your next meal is going to come around the corner. Now, the history of fasting, it's been part of human nature since the beginning of mankind. I remember when I was first doing this slide, it was in March of this year, and I'm sitting at my office desk looking out the window, and if you're from Toronto, for some reason, the winter didn't go away this year to like mid-May. It was really crazy. So I'm writing this slide, and I'm thinking about the history of fasting and how we must have fasted. We didn't have these local grocery stores or restaurants on every street corner. And I look outside, and it's miserable. There's an ice storm. There's like a foot of snow on the ground. And I started to laugh, because if I didn't have a refrigerator full of food, or I didn't have the ability to order food and have it delivered to my house, I wouldn't have had much of a variety outside to choose from that day. And I'm looking at the tree in my backyard thinking, bark, that would have been my only option. So obviously, humans had to come up with some sort of system for storing food energy as fat in order to survive. Because, well, we're very much alive here today. People have inhabited Canada for a very, very long time, and they obviously survived through winter without relying on bark. So we would have died a long, long time ago if we didn't really have an efficient system for storage and retrieval of food energy. And even when food became more available as we evolved as a species, most cultures and religions still prescribe to voluntary periods of fasting. So fasting has been practiced virtually every major religion worldwide, Jesus Christ, Buddha, the Muhammad prophet, or Prophet Muhammad, all believed in the healing powers of fasting. And once I started fasting and getting great health, and Jason was learning about fasting through myself, and we were going over my lab results, we entered Ramadan, the season of Ramadan. And I've said this many times, but Toronto's the most culturally diverse city on the world, and a third of our patients practice Ramadan. So we would always get super annoyed around the time of Ramadan because people would fast from sunrise to sunset for 30 days. And we would have to see them before Ramadan so we could adjust their medications, meaning reducing their blood pressure medication, reducing their blood sugar medication, because during Ramadan, their blood pressure would drop, their blood sugar would drop. And then at the end of Ramadan, they would feast, and then they would go back to their regular dietary habits. And we would have to see them again to increase all their medications, because as they resumed their normal diets, their blood pressures would go up, their blood sugar levels would go up. So Jason and I one day just started cracking up in the office thinking, oh my gosh, like why didn't we realize this earlier of the benefits of Ramadan? We have a lot of patients too in Toronto who practice Greek Orthodox, and they say, now during their fast, they abstain from meat. But going back to their grandparents' or great-grandparents' generation, they would actually fast, and they would fast upwards to 180 to 200 days per calendar year. So throughout human history, fasting's only been considered to be cleansing and beneficial. They haven't shown any detrimental effects on the human body. And when you look at descriptions of traditional societies, you hear how strong and energetic they are, not how weak and emaciated they are. So it's impossible to suggest that us humans, we do not have this really effective, amazing system to be able to store food energy and retrieve it when we need it. But instead, we waste away and we burn this muscle and we fall to the ground as this blob of fat. It just doesn't make sense. So how fasting works. So if you're new to fasting, I'm sorry, I need to get a graphic designer to make a better slide of this. If you're new to fasting, when you first start fasting, your body will sort of be fueling off of the glucose or ketones if you're following a ketogenic diet from your diet or from the food you consume when you first start. But as you start to fast, this is when people get a little bit concerned. Is there protein being broken down? And well, yes, there is some protein being broken down. Around the 24-hour mark of fasting, we do start to see gluconeogenesis occurring. But it's not just protein, as Siobhan so corrected me, because I was so fixated on protein earlier this year. But you do get it from fatty acids as well. So you do get some gluconeogenesis occurring, converting protein and fatty acids into glucose. But the more you continue on with your fast, as the hours and the days go by, your body's primarily fueling on ketone bodies, so fuel from fat rather than fuel from carbohydrates. So most of the patients, whenever I see a new patient in consultation and I say, I need you to fast for 36 hours, once they get over the idea of not eating for 36 hours, they all think that they're going to weaken. All their muscles are going to fall apart, they're going to eat away, and they're not going to be able to survive or function or even crawl on the ground. Until recently, there was a little bit limited data on fasting and lean mass. But in recent years, there's been some randomized control trials, some really good research that's come out that shows that actually fasting is superior to our standard caloric restriction diets at preserving lean mass. And not only does it show to preserve lean mass, it might actually show to generate lean mass. So this one randomized control trial, it was published in 2016. It took 2 groups of individuals and it assessed them over 32 weeks. Now, Group A reduced their calories by about 400 calories a day, and Group B did alternate daily fasting. So every other day, they just consumed water. So they took in a caloric intake of 0 every other day. But on their eating days, on their non-fasting days, they ate regularly. They didn't alter their caloric intake at all. And the results were quite astounding. So when we look at the reduction of the total fat mass that you have, we see the calorie restriction group only reduced their body fat over the 32 weeks by 0.7%, whereas the alternate daily fasting group reduced their body fat by 2.4%. And then when we assess, well, where was that fat lost? You know, there's fat that falls in your abdomen area, the trunk of your body, and we know that this is very unhealthy fat that leads to a lot of disease, diabetes, and heart disease. But the fat on the lower half of your body is not necessarily as detrimental. So when we want to target looking at that trunk fat, that really unhealthy fat, we see that the calorie restriction diet only showed a 0.3% reduction in total fat loss. But when you looked at the alternate daily fasting group, we saw a 1.8% reduction, which is quite superior, quite impressive compared to the standard calorie restriction group, which is supposed to be the be-all and the end-all of weight loss. And when we look at lean mass, so anytime you lose a body fat, your body composition is going to shift and your lean mass is going to increase. But in the calorie restriction group, we only saw an increase of lean mass of 0.5%. But in the alternate daily fasting group, we saw an increase of 2.2%. So it's a huge, huge difference and shows that alternate daily fasting and fasting in general is really quite beneficial for the preservation of lean mass and is much, much more superior than calorie restriction diets. Another thing, since I'm just talking about the study, I wanted to bring up resting metabolic rate, since everyone's secondary fear of fasting is that it's going to destroy their metabolic rate. Now, in this study, when they looked at resting metabolic rate between the two groups, they found that there was a clinically significant reduction in the resting metabolic rate for those individuals who followed a calorie restriction diet, but this was not observed in the alternate daily fasting group. Yes, there was a small dip in their resting metabolic rate, but it was not a clinically significant reduction. So people's concern is that every time Jason and I say it, yes, protein does get broken down during a fast, they start to panic. I think they have mental images of their biceps shrinking and they're just being bone with fat hanging off of their arm. But that's not the case. That's not necessarily what happens. So what happens to this protein that's lost during gluconeogenesis? So first of all, it doesn't start to occur in the body until about 24 hours after a fast. And our body has developed certain hormonal adaptations to the fasting. We produce counter-regulatory hormones. So what are these counter-regulatory hormones? Well, they have the opposite action of insulin. So when we're fasting, our insulin levels drop, and this is what signals the release of or increase in production of counter-regulatory hormones. But these hormones, so they run counter to insulin. So what insulin does is it drops blood sugar and it stores food energy, whereas counter-regulatory hormones increase food energy. They retrieve it. So insulin stores it, and counter-regulatory hormones retrieve it. So insulin drops blood glucose levels, counter-regulatory hormones increase glucose levels. This is why when so many of you are fasting, you're always so surprised that, it could be day 3 of your fast and your blood sugar levels are, still running around 110. And you're expecting them to be about 20 by day 3 of the fast, for most people who are new to fasting. So when your insulin level starts to drop, your body starts to increase production of adrenaline and noradrenaline, cortisol, and human growth hormone. And it's the human growth hormone, or the HGH, that's particularly interesting in terms of what happens with that protein in gluconeogenesis and fasting and why you don't waste away. So human growth hormone actually significantly increases during periods of fasting. Even 1 day of fasting, growth hormone increases 2 to 3 times, and it even continues to increase up to 5 days of fasting. So when you think about the fasting and feasting cycle, you eat, you may or may not have some glucose that is being ingested depending on your diet, but you most definitely are consuming some protein when you do eat. And your body will digest that protein and release the amino acids that are the building blocks of the protein that you consume, and they are absorbed and transported to the liver. Your body will secrete some insulin, depending on what you ate, will determine how much is secreted and whether or not you start to store food as body fat, food energy as body fat. Once that happens, your insulin levels start to decline, and this signals the fasting state. Once the fasting state is signaled, your body will then produce counter-regulatory hormones, will start to signal the liver to break down glycogen and convert it to glucose for energy. You'll start to experience some gluconeogenesis, so you'll get some fatty acids getting converted to glucose, and you'll get some protein being converted to glucose. And your body will transition from fueling on sugar, glucose metabolism, to fueling on fat, ketosis. So human growth hormone starts to get secreted, but no growth actually occurs while you're fasting because your body is not producing or secreting any insulin, and your mTOR levels are quite low. But what happens when you break your fast? What happens when you start eating? Well, you have the perfect storm to rebuild and build and generate new muscle. So when you go back to the fed state, you have this high human growth hormone production that has occurred while you've been in the fasted state. It's just sitting there waiting to grow you. You eat and most definitely are consuming some protein. So amino acids become plentiful in your system. Insulin is secreted, which stimulates protein synthesis. So you have the perfect cocktail to build and renew muscle. So when you're fasting, the primary concern is making sure you have enough glucose for normal brain function. But that requirement decreases substantially as your body starts using fatty acids to fuel and starts producing ketones, which can cross the blood-brain barrier and provide your big noggin here with plenty of fuel to function on. A lot of people think then their body is going to utilize the protein that's in their muscles. But actually, when you're experiencing gluconeogenesis, muscle cells are actually pretty preserved. Their turnover rate is very low. Where we see the most rapid turnover rate is in skin and intestinal lining. So is some protein loss a bad thing? Not necessarily. So when Jason and I started IDM, we were seeing patients in between all kinds of nephrology things. I was wrapping up the end of a 7-year study that I still have nightmares about case report forms from. We were really busy, and we were just busy trying to collect the data, trying to help people, trying to stop disease from progressing, that we missed some details that were happening with our patients. And one day we had this gentleman come in, and that day he had reached 164 pounds of weight loss. And so we were so excited. We hadn't seen him in a couple of months. He had become a very good faster and an excellent feaster. He didn't need to see us as often. And he turned to both Dr. Fung and I, and he said, "Megan, Dr. Fung, why have I lost 164 pounds and I don't have a whole bunch of loose skin?" He said, "I could be firmer. I definitely was when I was a young boy. My body's not perfect, but I don't have drapes of skin. And at 164 pounds of weight loss and only standing at 5'4", I would expect that I would have a lot of loose skin." And Jason and I just kind of looked at each other and tilted our heads and said, "Huh." And so this gentleman left, and Jason looked at me, and he said, "What are you, 5 feet tall?" I said, "Well, yes, I like to tell people I'm 5'3", but I'm about 5 feet tall." And he said, "And you've lost 86 pounds." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Are you drapey anywhere?" And I was like, "Jesus, no, I'm not. No, I'm not." And he said, "Have you ever thought about that?" And I said, "No, like I'm young, everyone says you're young and things work out for you a little bit better." So I thought because of my age, it was just easier for me to firm up. But this gentleman who we saw in clinic that day was about 60 years old, and at 60 years old, you think it'd be a little bit more difficult to firm up. And Jason said, "Can we pull some of the charts of our other patients who have lost close to 100 pounds or more?" So I pulled about a dozen charts, and we're looking at them, and I invited the patients to come in, and they were all pretty firm too. And when we talked to them about it, they said, yeah, it didn't make sense to them. They, yes, they could have been more firm. They were a little bit older, though. They weren't pumping iron at the gym or being all that particularly active in their day-to-day lives. But they said they had expected to actually have a lot more skin. So we find that when a lot of our patients are fasting, our bodies, that someone quoted this on Friday, quoted Jason and said, our bodies are not that dumb, They don't work against us. They work in our favor. And when we store body fat, we develop connective tissue to help us support that body fat. But when we burn that body fat, we no longer really need that connective tissue. And our bodies try to preserve and conserve as much energy as possible. So why are our bodies going to spend important metabolic dollars preserving connective tissue that our body really doesn't need anymore? So we start to see that that is the protein that's being broken down. And typically, the longer the patients fast for, the less loose skin they have. We do have patients who have come to us after following a low-carb or ketogenic diet, maybe doing 16 or 24 hours of intermittent fasting very regularly, and we do see that they are not firm. They often require skin removal surgery. And at that point, fasting for 7 days or fasting for 365 days isn't going to really have a massive impact at them reducing their skin. But we found a lot with patients from day one of weight loss, where not only low-carb and ketogenic diets have been a priority, but fasting therapeutically has also been a priority, that our patients tend to remain quite firm throughout their weight loss process. So therapeutic fasting that we found that has worked really well at maintaining this firmness and preventing a lot of loose skin is 36 or 42 hours of intermittent fasting with the occasional extended fast. Now, again, I had a young cousin who didn't listen to me about weight loss, but he did lose 100 pounds, so I'm very proud of him. And now he's trying to fast himself out of his loose skin, and I had to have a very real conversation with him. I'll help him, but I'm not quite sure what the results are going to be. So it's different for everybody, but for most people who start the fasting along with the diet and at the start of their weight loss journey, we actually see them will not have a whole lot of loose skin, quite firm. I can't tell you the number of 75-year-old men that have pumped their bicep muscles in the clinic to show me and how impressed that they are with the result. So sometimes protein loss is not necessarily a bad thing. And when you compare obese individuals to non-obese subjects, obese individuals have 50% more protein than lean individuals because of that excessive skin and connective tissue. And when we examine obese subjects compared to lean subjects, we find that the obese subjects burn 2 to 3 times less protein than their lean subjects. Dr. Fung always uses this analogy. I heard him say it one day. I don't think he thought it was particularly brilliant, but I did. And I probably have said it to every single patient or client that I've worked with over the last 7 years who has expressed some concern about wasting away into a little blob while they're fasting. So if you're at a cabin in the woods and there's a snowstorm outside, but on your front porch, you have 100 logs of firewood just sitting there. And it's really, really cold inside of the cabin. And you want to make a fire. What are you going to use to make the fire? Are you going to go grab an axe and start cutting up your sofa and your coffee table and your dining table? No, that stuff's expensive. I just moved. I bought furniture. Oh, my goodness. Nobody. I put, plastic covers on it. I'm channeling my inner grandmother now. That stuff's expensive. You're going to use the firewood that's already cut up for you on your porch. It's not like you have to go deep into the woods and knock down a tree yourself in the middle of a snowstorm to have firewood. In that case, you might throw in an end table you don't like so much into the fireplace. But the point is, a lot of us have lots of excess fire logs in our system. I always giggle. I saw this video of Carl back in Breckenridge a couple of years ago, and he was talking about how he was going to start his fasting after all of the feasting we did in Breckenridge. And he said, so today I'm fueling on a little bit of neck fat here. And I started to giggle, and Jason was like, ew, that's gross. And I said, but it's true. And so our bodies, Carl's neck, he's got extra fire fuel there. Why would we hack up something that's expensive, something that's highly functional, when we've got plenty of firewood in our system? Fat is just stored food energy, meant to be utilized later on. Muscle has lots of functions. It's there to keep us strong and healthy and support our organs, and amongst many, many other functions. So why would we burn any of this fuel, why would we burn any of this muscle mass when we have all of this fuel sitting in our system? It just doesn't make any sense. So again, when you compare obese subjects to lean subjects, we see that in obese subjects, 94% of our energy expense comes that day from fat oxidation. And again, we're burning 2 to 3 times less protein. In lean subjects, we see that 78% of our energy expenditure comes from fat oxidation. So it's a little bit different when we're working with lean participants. Now, there are a lot of patients nowadays with type 1.5 diabetes, which tend to be very slender individuals, or skinny fat individuals, or just plain quite thin individuals who don't have a lot of organ and visceral fat. We also see a lot of type 1 diabetics benefiting from time-restricted eating and some mild intermittent fasting protocols. But they tend to be quite on the slender side of things. And then we have healthier individuals that are very interested in experiencing autophagy, which my good friend Dr. Nadir is going to talk about shortly after this presentation in great detail. But they're lean. I have professional athletes who come to us and hear about the benefits of fasting for reducing inflammation, but they're 7% body fat, and they need to fast for at least 36 hours to get the healing benefits they're looking for. So when we work with lean individuals, we really encourage them to increase their fat intake quite substantially the day before a fast or in the few days leading up to a fast. So we tend to increase their fat intake by about 30 to 50 grams of fat per day. We also increase their protein intake too by about 20 to 30 grams per day before entering a fast. And I work with some professional athletes, and they'll fast for 5 days of water fasting at a time. Most publicly who's spoken out and who has given permission countless times for me to speak about him is George St. Pierre. He's a UFC fighter, world heavyweight champion, and he was diagnosed with colitis and really believed in the benefits of fasting, and he has reversed his colitis. But he had to do quite aggressive fasting to do so. And well, if you've seen him, you can't pinch him. He has solid muscle and about 7% body fat. But despite all of his aggressive fasting, he's actually gained lean mass. And that's because of all the wonderful benefits of human growth hormone, eating the right foods when you break a fast, and just being mindful about what you consume before you start a fast if you are lean. The last time I talked about this, people wanted to know a little bit more about measuring body composition so they could keep a check on whether or not reasons for weight fluctuations had to do with their lean mass actually increasing. Sometimes people know they're losing inches, but that's not necessarily reflected on the scale, and they're interested to know if they're perhaps retaining water, or if maybe they're actually gaining lean mass. And as clinicians, we know that they're gaining lean mass, but this is very difficult, especially for the woman or the man who's been taught that the scale and their body weight is the be-all and the end-all, when it's really not. Body composition is what's very important. So I get asked all of the time, what's the best way to measure body composition? Well, MRI is the gold standard, but not easily obtainable. And probably the next best thing that's easily accessible and is economical is a DEXA body composition scan. You can find these in most major cities or even some smaller cities, and they range from about $50 to $100 depending on the location and how many you may purchase. But there are some faults of DEXA body composition scans. So when our patients want to measure their body composition, we don't recommend they do it more frequently than once every 3 to 6 months. And the reason why is because the test is not perfect. Your body, if you're an individual, perhaps, who has a body with a lot of visceral fat, organ fat, fatty liver, fatty pancreas, I'm seeing a lot of fatty spleens at the clinic, that makes your organs look bigger. And body composition scans, they don't pick that up as body fat. They don't recognize the fat in your liver as body fat. Now, if you've got a fatty liver, you've got metabolic issues. Fatty liver is sort of where diabetes starts to manifest. So you don't want to have a fatty liver, but if you have a DEXA scan with a fatty liver, it will show that you have a strong liver. You have more muscle than you actually do. So there's some issues with this. So once you start fasting and you start losing that fat from the liver, from the pancreas, or other places, then the DEXA scan that you have as a follow-up will actually show a decrease in lean mass percentage, which isn't necessarily accurate. You didn't have that lean mass to start with. You just had a fatty liver to start with, which is something you definitely don't want. So you need to be mindful of these limitations when having DEXA scans. Also, if you just carved up, my good friend Dave Feldman did an experiment last year on himself where he carved up like crazy, went for a body composition scan, and showed that his lean muscle had gone up through the roof over the course of about 10 days. Well, when you do carb up, your body stores a lot of that carb as glycogen in your liver, in your muscles, and you retain a lot of water as a result of that too, which makes you look a whole lot beefier, muscular than you actually are. So your diet can be also quite reflective. If you're storing a lot of glycogen based on a recent meal or series of meal and water, it can alter the results of your DEXA body composition scan. All right, so everyone, thank you very much for joining me today, and I will pass the mic off to back to Nick Mailer.
Thanks, Megan. We really are running more on time than we even need to be, which is unusual for a conference, but that's because we're all running on ketones. We're going to bring up Dr. Ali now, and he's going to talk about understanding autophagy, cell repair, renewal, and remodeling. So let's welcome Dr. Ali. Test it. Do you want to put this and click it on?
Hello? Yeah.
There. I'll leave that there in case it goes off.
And that's my clicker.
And that's the clicker. Yeah, Ted, you want to test it?
I guess everybody can hear me? Yeah. It's an honor to be back in New London again, renewing friendship. And I couldn't be happier that Megan laid the foundations for my talk. Because autophagy is something that is so important that I have been completely fascinated by it. So, guess to forward it, is the computer frozen, Nick? So, I don't want to lose time out here, and while that is being fixed. So when I want to give you a metaphor for autophagy as to what autophagy is. Like, let's say you you're in the habit of eating constantly and cooking constantly. Your kitchen would look dirty. It'll have all kinds of junk around it. And so it's the other way. Oh, okay. So here is how your kitchen would look like if you don't clean. And if you're cleaning it, it'll look better. So constantly eating and feeding yourself is a situation in which you are not performing self-cleaning. Sometimes, despite the fact that you clean the kitchen quite well, there's a little grime left that you cannot remove, the stuff doesn't work, the burner doesn't work as well, the cabinets are loose, and you got to do a deeper cleaning or you got to do remodeling. So that's what autophagy is all about. I have put a picture of a cell. We are made of trillions of these cells, and I'm pointing out to the mitochondria, which is the energy burning part of our cell, that's the engine of the cell, and the endoplasmic reticulum, which is where you make protein, that is the protein making factory. And then the subject of our talk, which is the lysosome. The lysosome is the recycling center. So as we get older and as we practice the standard American diet, our organelles, the small protein-making factory in our body, it gets older, it gets swollen up, it doesn't function as well. The mitochondria, which are the engine, they start spewing out oxidative damage, which is just another way of saying that they create too much fire. So all of these organelles need to be repaired. Now, Megan talked a lot about protein. Now, protein is very important to give us structural integrity. And the protein has to be shaped in a certain way. When you are making protein through damaged protein manufacturing endoplasmic reticulum, that protein is misfolded. And a misfolded protein doesn't function as well. It needs to be cleared out. And if you don't clear it out, it aggregates. These aggregates can sometimes become filaments, and if these filaments become permanent, then they are called amyloid. So my wife has all of these cleaning mechanisms in her kitchen: water, scrub, soap, all kinds of recycling bags, and a recycling center. And similarly, our cell has excellent recycling mechanisms. So recycling is initiated. If you look at the top right-hand corner for you of the slide, there is a set of proteins that recognize that cleaning needs to happen. These are called autophagy initiator complex. And in my house, it's my wife who's the initiator. What she does is that she gives me a garbage bag and says, hey, take this garbage bag and go and pick up all the stuff in the kitchen. So really what's happening is that a garbage bag is formed in the cell, and that's called the phagosome, and it goes and picks up senescent organelles, protein aggregates that our cell does not need and needs to clear, and it takes it to this recycling center that's called the lysosome. And the lysosome is just not a trash disposal. It is much more than that, because what it is doing is that it is breaking down the protein into amino acids, it is breaking down rancid fat to fatty acids, and recycling them to new protein and new cell membranes. So this slide is meant to convey to you that the initiator complex is very important, and it's under the control of something called mTOR. mTOR is a protein that goes and binds to this initiator complex, and it prevents it from activating autophagy. So conditions of nutrient excess, if you're eating all the time, if your insulin levels are high, if you're making certain growth factors that are insulin dependent, like insulin-like growth factor, there is a tight coupling of the mTOR to the autophagy complex, and you don't, to the autophagy initiation complex, and you don't perform autophagy. On the other hand, in order to initiate the cleaning mechanism, you need to dissociate the mTOR from this complex, and you can do that by the mechanisms of fasting and exercise. So I stole this slide from Professor Ushumi. He won the Nobel Prize for defining the mechanisms of fasting back in 2016. And he takes a 60-kilogram Japanese male, And he says a Japanese male at 60 kilograms will have 9 kilograms of muscle mass. And every day, this person is breaking down 240 grams of protein and making 240 grams of protein. I never thought about it that way, but when you think about it that way, it makes sense that a person eats only 70 grams of protein per day, a 60 kilogram man, that's about the protein he would eat. So where is the other 170 grams of protein coming from to remake the protein? And it's coming from recycling. It's coming from taking out dead protein that our body has. In fact, this recycling mechanism is so important that our body replaces its entire protein in 3 years. So, not to get daunted by the slide, there is not just one mechanism of autophagy. I'd be able to get only into 2 mechanisms today. My Twitter feed is filled with different types of autophagy. You can go and look at that. But this is an especially interesting mechanism. It's called chaperone-mediated autophagy. And what that really is that there is a set of chaperone proteins that recognize dysfunctional proteins, misfolded proteins, protein aggregates. It picks it up and brings it to the recycling center. And when it brings it to the recycling center, the analogy I want to give to you is that my wife says, hey, you didn't clean the kitchen well. Here is this Dyson vac. There are those breadcrumbs out there. Go pick them up. So it's much like taking a Dyson vac and picking up these protein crumbs in your cell, bringing it to the recycling center. And the recycling center has a certain protein, which is called LAMP3. So in order to tell you what LAMP3 is, just nothing like but an InSinkerator. So you put the junk into the InSinkerator, and it just washes it off. But it's a little bit better than that, because it takes the protein into the lysosome, it breaks it down into amino acid, and reuses it. So it's not just aerating, but it's also recycling. Why is this so important? The reason it's important is that the reason our brains age is because of protein aggregates. So clearing the protein aggregates in our brain is one of the fundamental mechanisms of remaining young and not getting Alzheimer's. And if you are not activating this form of autophagy, you will get plaques and you will get dementia. In fact, the amyloid is a protein aggregate that is happening because of lack of autophagy. Similarly, if you have Parkinson's disease, you get a different kind of protein aggregate called the Lewy body, and so on for Huntington's disease and for ALS. So this is work of Dr. Mark Mattson. He's at the National Institute of Aging. And he says that autophagy in the brain is highly important for 2 processes. The first process is neurogenesis. You form new brain cells if you are clearing out the dead stuff. The other reason why autophagy is important is for what is called synaptic plasticity. So each neuron communicates with another neuron through these dendrites, through these finger-like projections. And the neurotransmission is happening between these connections. What is shown on the middle of the slide is a dendrite, is a nerve ending that is healthy. It has been doing autophagy. The mitochondria are better. They are numerous. You see the garbage bag phagolysosome that is moving towards the center of the cell so that the cell can eliminate dead debris. Whereas the one on the extreme right is showing that there are fewer mitochondria that are dysfunctional. The phagosome, the garbage bag, is more towards the periphery and not being cleared. So this is not capable of good neurotransmission. A similar group has done work on rhesus monkeys. They've taken rhesus monkeys and they have calorie restricted them to 30% of what a control monkey ate. And it's fascinating to see their brains. Their brains have preservation of gray matter. Their neurotransmission is better. And this group postulated that the reason the rhesus monkey with calorie restriction was able to retain the brain function is because of mechanisms of autophagy. So there are two other concepts that I want to get into. One of them is called apoptosis, and the other one is necrosis, in which you have cell death. So on your right is a room that is sort of disorganized, dysfunctional, and I think only a mother can clean that room. But sometimes even they give up. On the right is a sort of a situation which is toxic disorganization, which you will say, this is not salvageable. So in the first situation, you would board up the house and do a controlled destruction. On the other side, you'd say, no, this should be bulldozed. So this is showing you necrosis. Necrosis is a cell as it ages, as you're doing the standard American diet, it swells up, the protein-making machinery is not functioning well. You can repair that by promoting autophagy, but if you don't, and there is persistent injury, the cell dies, it spills its contents into its milieu, inflammatory cells come in and cause inflammation. On the other hand, if the cell is to die, but it is not as injured and you're practicing autophagy, the cell shrinks, it breaks up into small pieces, it's picked up by the macrophages without inciting inflammation, and that is apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. So now, so far I have told you about autophagy, and now you're saying, what starts autophagy? And there's a lot out there on the internet that says, hey, you can have apple cider vinegar, green tea, you can eat certain kinds of protein to activate autophagy. And I want to tell you that there's probably very little evidence for that. What I want to do is to use a tagline from Smith Barney, which says, they make money the old-fashioned way, they earn it. So you have to earn autophagy by fasting. And like Megan said, long-term fasting is better than short-term fasting. You got to earn autophagy by reducing your carb intake. Low-carb diet reduces insulin, that helps. Exercise is an important way in which you cause nutrient depletion, and I will get into the weeds of that a little bit more. Now, what happens as we get older? As you get older, there's a continual decline in your autophagy. It's coming down. And if you are accelerating it by eating a standard American diet, it's going to come down even faster. On the other hand, if you're practicing autophagy, if you're practicing a low-carb diet, autophagy comes down much slower, and you can intersperse that with periods of fasting and exercise to prevent that decline. So what evidence can I give you from animal studies? So this is a rat study. Fisher rats were taken. They were divided into 4 groups. A group that was studied at 7 months, but given all ad libitum food and kept sedentary. Second group at 28 months, sedentary, given all the food that it wanted. And a third and fourth group that were studied at 28 months, but they were calorie restricted only by about 8%. And the fourth group was exercised, the third group was kept sedentary. Now, what I have shown you is that there is this garbage bag disposal mechanism of autophagy. It forms this garbage bag, which is called the phagosome. And you can identify the phagosome by a specific protein, which is called LC3. So the goal of the study was to find out which group of animals had the highest presence of LC3. And the group that had the highest presence of LC3 was the group of animals that were calorie restricted and exercised. Now, what about the chaperone autophagy, the LAMP protein, the insyncerator that I talked to you about? Which group of animals had the highest induction of chaperone-mediated autophagy? It was again the group of animals that were calorie restricted and exercised. Now, we talked about that mitochondrial health, the engine of our cell, is highly dependent on autophagy. If you're not practicing autophagy, the mitochondria get diseased. When they oxidize something, they create a lot of fire. That's called oxidative damage. In the middle of the slide are mitochondria that are healthy, and when they burn fuel, they don't create as much fire. Now, you can measure the degree of oxidative damage by checking something called 4-HNE. And the group of animals that had the least amount of oxidative damage or production of fire was the group that exercised and was calorie restricted. Now, we talked about apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. You don't want that. You want the cell to have autophagy so that it can repair itself. Which group of animals had the lowest amount of apoptotic index, lowest amount of programmed cell death? It was again the group of animals that were calorie restricted and exercised. Now, moving on, I want to talk to you about a human study. So they took 11 people who were ultra-endurance runners. They would run for 24 hours. I don't know why anybody would want to do that. In 24 hours, they covered 150 kilometers. They were not able to eat as much as they were burning. In fact, they could only take about 30% of the caloric needs. And as Megan pointed out, we have a robust machinery to make sugar. We are not eating sugar, but we can maintain sugar. So over a 24-hour period, their sugars did not go down. But their insulin levels did fall. Now, as you're exercising, you use energy currency. Energy currency in our body is called ATP. So ATP gets broken to ADP by giving a phosphate molecule an energy that the cell uses, and then it finally becomes AMP. So when you have AMP, you activate something called AMP kinase. Now, AMP kinase is a master regulator of autophagy, because when AMP kinase levels go up, it increases the garbage disposal mechanism. It reduces the activity of mTOR. So they took these individuals and then did muscle biopsies before and afterwards to show that AMP kinase activity was increased by about 250% in these after exercise. That the activity of mTOR, the one that blocks autophagy, was decreased by 30%. What about the garbage disposal mechanism, which is the LC3 protein? So the LC3 protein picks up, it forms the autophagolysosome. It had gone up by more than 500%. Now, this is another study in which they took trained athletes, well-trained athletes, divided them into 3 groups: a sedentary group, a low-intensity group, and a high-intensity group. So to the sedentary group, they didn't exercise them, but to the low intensity, they made them do this unthinkable thing of making them run for 2 hours on a treadmill at 50% of their maximal oxygen consumption or at 70%. And they were studied both in fasted and fed state, and muscle biopsies were done at various different time points. What happened? Now, when you look at the activity of AMP kinase, and they measured a surrogate of that, the group that did high-intensity exercise had the highest activation compared to the sedentary group. Fasting or feeding did not seem to make a difference. What about the garbage-type mechanism, the autophagolysosome, the LC3 protein? Which group had the highest autophagy out there? It was, again, the high-intensity group compared to the low-intensity or the sedentary group. Fasting or feeding in the study did not make a difference. Now, autophagy does many different things, and one of the functions of autophagy is to fight invaders. If you have robust autophagy, the bacteria are taken in by the phagolysosome. It's given to the lysosome, which has got powerful enzymes to destroy the bacteria. And it is not only good for common bacteria like strep, but it also is important for reducing TB. Now, I wanted to take a few extra minutes to tell you a very important concept that Megan brought up, and that is called glucose-induced substrate hysteresis. And I'd like your indulgence because I want to read this slide out, that there is asymmetry in the ease of metabolic adaptation towards sugar versus fat. The longer the body favors glycolysis, which is sugar burning, the harder it is to switch to fat burning. Metabolic flexibility is progressively and irreversibly lost with age and is accelerated by the standard American diet. Perhaps this loss is because you're losing chaperone autophagy, and I want to get into the weeds of that a little bit. So now this is a glycolytic pathway. This is the pathway through which we burn sugar, and I don't really even want you to look at it. The only reason I put it up there is because it's got so many different enzymes. I want you to focus on this slide, which is that when you lose the chaperone autophagy, your glycolytic enzymes get upregulated, so you're only capable of burning sugar. You're gluconeogenic. Our body is capable of making all the sugar it needs, but you downregulate that mechanism. You downregulate the mechanism for burning fat. So what is happening here is that you are reducing a specific kind of autophagy. What you are doing is that you're capable of only burning sugar. So if somebody is metabolically unhealthy, he comes to you and you say, hey, take this low-carb diet. And that person comes back and tells you that I've been practicing it, I've been getting no benefit. Rather than like every other doctor tells you that you are morally deficient, you're not motivated, maybe this person has lost his mechanism to burn fat. And he may need to consult with Jason and Megan because reactivation of these enzymes would require a prolonged period of fast. So I love the podcast that Carl and Richard have in which they talk about the things that they got wrong. So I've been practicing for about 5 to 6 years in low carb. And what I got wrong was my insistence to my patients that they should fast for no longer than 48 hours because I was scared, like some other groups, that fasting for longer than that, you would be losing protein mass. Little did I realize that you're not losing really biceps and muscles. What you're losing is junk protein. And when you fast for prolonged periods of time, there is a pulsatile increase in growth hormone. In fact, the whole weightlifter community, the muscle building community, is so fascinated by autophagy that they try to activate it in every possible way. So the question that comes about is that, how long do I need to fast? So the answer to that is it depends. How insulin resistant you are, how obese you are you following a standard American diet? Do you have unhealthy fat cells? Unhealthy fat cells are seen when your triglycerides are high and when your good cholesterol is low. That is not the situation with lean mass hyperresponders. Is there inflammation? Are you old? Because when you are old, your autophagy mechanisms may have gone down, and you may need, and I was happy with a 3-day fast, but talking to Megan, these people might need a 7-day fast. On the other hand, if you look like this, you are insulin sensitive, you can make ketones easily, you are doing a low-carb diet, you have good quality cholesterol, in other words, your fat cells are healthy, that you exercise, you have less inflammation, you're young, you can perhaps initiate autophagy within 1 day. Now, there are some populations in which you need a prolonged fasting in order to activate autophagy. And these are people who are insulin resistant, who have unhealthy fat cells as shown by high triglycerides and low HDL, who have inflammation, who have high blood pressure, and who have neurodegenerative disorders in their early stages. Insulin is important because insulin binds to mTOR, and when it binds to mTOR, it prevents autophagy. So high insulin state means that you need to bring it down with prolonged fasting. Unhealthy fat cells are fat cells that cannot take any fat in. So fat increases in the bloodstream as triglycerides. And unhealthy fat cells die. They attract macrophages, which is inflammation. And when you have inflammation, you are activating mTOR, and you are preventing autophagy from happening, and you're not doing any of the cleaning mechanisms that autophagy is meant to do. Now, high blood pressure is a special situation. In high blood pressure, it is the brainstem that is increasing a sympathetic response. It's the fight or flight response. It's the adrenaline response. It increases your blood pressure. It increases your heart rate. It drops your heart rate variability. On the other hand, if the brainstem is going through autophagy, it has the parasympathetic response. It's mediated by a nerve called the vagus. It drops your blood pressure, drops your heart rate, increases your heart rate variability. But it is the sympathetic response that activates the mTOR. It prevents autophagy. So prolonged fasting is important, but I think it should be medically supervised. You need to talk to Megan or one of his colleagues, because you need to adjust your blood pressure and diabetic medications, much as she pointed out. You also need to learn how to measure sugar and ketones, and perhaps refeeding should be better organized. Not practicing autophagy is like never upgrading your car. You have never enjoyed the benefits of Bluetooth, of GPS, of adaptive cruise control, of self-driving features. So in conclusion, what you're doing with autophagy is that you're removing rancid fat. You're removing dead protein. You're removing senescent organelles through this beautiful mechanism that our body has created, because we have nutrient excess in this world. Our ancestors didn't have a fridge and a supermarket. They were forced to go through autophagy. We aren't. And when you do that, the body is not just self-eating. It's not just cleanup and disposal. It is recycling, it's repairing, it's remodeling, it's preventing infections. And by doing that, it's also reducing cancer risk, something that we could not get into detail. So all of these benefits are happening to you in terms of the cleanup mechanisms. And when you do that, what's going to happen is that you're going to reduce your blood pressure, one of the best ways to do it, reduce your heart rate, increase heart rate variability, which is a good thing. You're going to improve your cholesterol quality. You're going to improve your insulin sensitivity. You're going to reduce inflammation, and that's what's going to prolong longevity. The chaperone-mediated autophagy needs a slightly different conclusion, because it's extremely important for our brain health. And in order to prevent neurodegenerative disorders, the CMA, as it is called, may need exercise and more long-term fasting according to the studies, and may not be started or activated by short-term fasting. So what do? I say that a lifelong of a ketogenic or a low-carb diet is a good thing, that several days a week an 18-hour fast with a 6-hour feeding interval is good, that movement and exercise is important, but I have firmly moved over into the Jason Fung and Megan Ramos camp by saying that you need 2 to 3 times a year in which you need to do a prolonged fast in order to robustly activate your autophagy mechanisms. And my tagline is that promoting the biologic mechanisms of autophagy is the defining opportunity of our time to improve human health and prolong longevity. So thank you.
Well, we are running very much ahead of schedule, which is nice. But before we go out to the break, Elise, if you're here, Elise wants to have a few words. Elise Mullins. Okay, she can come up later. Well, we were due to come back at 10:45, but if we maybe come 10 minutes earlier at 10:35, it'll give Dave some time to run a bit long, because I saw his beta yesterday and he really needs to run a bit long. So right now it's the break, and at 10:35 Dave will have more time. Thanks. Okay, everybody, thank you for coming back after the break. Before we begin with Dave's talk, we're going to have Elise to have a few words. Thanks.
Okay, I just want to say thank you to everybody, obviously, for being here, especially a couple of the companies that have helped sponsor. Keto & Company, who I work for, thank you. We will be serving our 4-cheese cauliflower rice with lunch today, so please enjoy. Foxhill Kitchen has given so much of her bread and so much of her time with everything with the burgers yesterday and with the grilled cheese today. That leads into Bunker Hill, who has donated all of the cheese to enjoy today. IDM, Select Savory Seasonings, Love Good Fats, Moonsgrove Farms, Peak, I said Bunker Hill, Redmond Salt, Nutrition Coalition, Stoka, Front Porch Pecans, Nush, Be Mixed, and Moat Mountain Peely Nuts have all contributed lots of product for you guys to enjoy, try out. If you guys haven't made it upstairs to get a mocktail, there are virgin margaritas and a few other cocktails by Be Mixed, so please enjoy. If you guys have any questions, please come and see me. I will be running around per usual.
Thank you, Elise. So coming up now is Dave Feldman, who is going to talk about the change we required, how citizen science is reshaping our understanding of medicine and nutrition. So let's slam our hands together. The MVP for Dave.
Yep, that's it. Try this little button down here. Right there. Oh, because there's 2 instances of it open. Gotcha. Yeah, now you may want to try. Oh, but I don't want it in the... That's all right, that's all right. It's fine. Go and give it up for Nick, by the way. So so my talk, if this advances, which it's not. Yeah. All right. Yes, this is a change that requires citizen science is reshaping our understanding of medicine and nutrition. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, let me give you my disclosures. And let me give you a quick bio. Really, a lot of you guys already pretty much know me by this point. I'm an obsessive N of 1 software engineer who really gets a lot of joy for some reason in being poked by needles. And really, the only thing that changes on this is the high score, which I'm sure you're all very interested in, and it's up to 118 in the last 44 months. Siobhan's, by the way, trying to catch up with me. I don't know how well she's going to do. We'll see in time. Well, it's 2019, and I want to help to kind of lay a landscape that many of you guys need to understand to better understand where I'm coming from for this talk. And right now, we believe in organizations. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's a kind of official organizational advantage. And by that I mean we're wired to consolidate information because we prefer to learn about what we are passionate about, but we rely on trusted sources for the things we're not passionate about. And this makes a lot of sense. It's how we're actually built. It's why specialization is so great. And so sources that are trusted by the majority of people often enjoy a greater automatic acceptance, such as large official organizations. This is a fictional one, but let's just say you wanted to get into underwater basket weaving. You probably right now could find a society of underwater basket weaving, and they probably have a lot of materials available for you online right now. And this is kind of key because some organizations can be less concerned with responding to scrutiny unless overwhelming data accumulates against their position. That can be a bit of a challenge. So, with that in mind, this is the information ecosystem that we imagine. We think, hey, there's all these expert studies that are actually being built, and they're very sciencey, but you know what? We may not be as into that subject, so fortunately we have a lot of experts themselves who can help us with this. How do they help us with this? Well, they actually help to develop a simple explanation and advice that they can then bring to us, the masses. And you know what's even better? What's even better, and if you think about it, is actually a modern phenomenon. It's never really happened quite like it has in the last few decades, is what if these experts band together on a particular discipline, not just underwater basket weaving, but let's say cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Wouldn't it be great if they kind of get together and then they help to develop these documents for us to share and understand a little bit better for ourselves? Naturally, I'm going to go ahead and pick an example we're all very familiar with, a simple explanation and advice that would be the food pyramid. Now, certainly a lot of you guys in this room are going to be opinionated about the food pyramid, but this is in fact something for which there was enormous amounts of input on. I certainly recommend you read Taubes and Teicholz and many of the different documentaries that help to show how this all came together. But it definitely had a lot of experts that weighed in before we finally got this particular document. And look, this is developing a kind of two populations that I like to call confident mainstreamers and alternative thinkers. And the confident mainstreamer, they're very much the product of this process. And to be fair, we are confident mainstreamers ourselves in many disciplines outside of this. If you look at it, we're brand loyal to certain things like, say, Apple or Microsoft and so forth. And so we like the digest version that we get from experts that we trust in the field. And so I call these the confident mainstreamer. But sometimes if the confident mainstreamer isn't developed, you end up getting, through this other knowledge pathway, what I like to call the alternative thinker. And especially when it comes to things like medicine and nutrition, the alternative thinker says, actually, I kind of want to go and look at the evidence myself. I kind of want to form my own opinion just based on what it is that I can come up with, even though I'm not an expert. And then I'll have my own alternative hypothesis. Okay, so here's the catch. Confident mainstreamers have strength in numbers, and this makes sense. Because after all, there's a lot more people who are willing to take the existing expert advice than there are those who are going to actually look into the subject themselves and become well educated in what it means. And that's somewhat understandable because, look, let's face it, alternative thinkers come in a wide spectrum. Some have many theories that are easily falsified. You certainly know some people who have a different opinion of what you'd see from experts that you'd go, nah, I don't think I would trust that. No. But conversely, there are some who have alternative ideas that ultimately turn out to be valid. Now, here's where it gets interesting. There's also now a more common new phenomenon where the experts, especially if they're part of an organization, get involved in this conversation, especially over social media. They often throw further confidence to the confident mainstreamers and say, that's right, and you're following the guidelines properly, you're doing a good job. But likewise, they also participate and go, quit looking at these kooks. They are not the tops of the field. You've got to quit bothering with listening to those people who don't share the information that we're sharing to you. But, as I said from a little bit earlier, and this is key, you need to remember this. Some organizations can be less concerned with responding to scrutiny unless overwhelming data accumulates against their position. This is super relevant. With that in mind, let me talk about formal and citizen science. And this is basically my own divide, but I think a lot of you would probably agree. Formal science, it typically will be funded by institutions or industry, often a combination of both. Citizen science is typically self-funded. On formal science, it's generally directed and staffed by formal credentialed scientists, where, of course, citizen science is generally conducted by non-trained scientists. And on the formal side, there's usually involvement with official bodies like IRB, which you're not going to see as often on the citizen science side. And this is perhaps the most important. Formal science seeks to end up in the literature. They want to be published in scientific journals, whereas citizen science is generally seeking to share these experiments through social media, forums, and blogs. Now, if you're looking at this snapshot before everything I just told you, it's totally understandable why you would trust those people on the left side over those people on the right side. It makes sense, and you need to understand this moving forward. But who are these citizen scientists? You are. You are. You are. You're all citizen scientists. I've anointed you right now. No. Let me actually give you a very distinctive example. This is, of course, very personal to me and to Siobhan, who helps us run the Cholesterol Code website. And look, we just have this very, very basic message we want to test. We want to say, look, isn't it possible that high cholesterol might make sense if it's for a metabolic reason? And what we'd like to do is we'd like to bring that to medical professionals, especially as they come to see more and more low carbers. But that's a challenge, because guess what? These same medical professionals, they're parts of these organizations or take advice from the organizations or other experts and have got very different training. And you need to empathize with both the organizations and the medical professionals as to why that happens. But here's where it gets interesting. This is an indirect pathway. As they get more and more low-carb patients, the patients happen to get a lot more of our information, and then they end up directing it back to their medical professionals. So we have this great phenomenon where basically most medical professionals learn about cholesterol code and begin to follow the work after one or more patients bring it to their attention. That's pretty fascinating, because now the direction of flow goes the other way. We now have more than ever non-low-carb clinicians that approach us about the research, wanting to know and understand it better for their low-carb patients. That's quite phenomenal. But I actually want to use one of my favorite examples, because this is very personal to me, and this has to do with something I read before I went on the low-carb diet. And this is actually from the American Diabetes Association. They had a myths page. I wanted to really investigate whether or not I needed carbohydrates. And on this myths page in January 2014, which is when I read it, it says, myth: if you have diabetes, you should only eat small amounts of starchy foods such as bread, potatoes, and pasta. As you can see in here, and this is looking at it through the Wayback Machine, a place to start is about 45 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per meal, or 3 to 4 servings of carbohydrate-containing foods. Show of hands, who will have at least 45 grams of carbs at all today?
Too high.
Exactly. So what happened is I then went through the Wayback Machine. It's a great device, by the way, a great website that you can work through older pages. And I found the first instance where this actually changed materially. And it wasn't until January of 2018. In January 18, this page and this particular myth, the text had changed to now say, wondering how much carbohydrates you can have? The amount of carbohydrate you need will vary based on many factors. And that's definitely a very distinctive change. And even then, I'll bet some people are going to quibble with the need word, but one step at a time, right? So look, I have this term I like to call it the pivotal patient. And I think I started thinking of it that way as I listened to, say, Ted Naiman and David Unwin. They all have a story of how they were a conventional doctor first, and then they had a particular patient, a particular low-carb patient, who they observed seemed to thrive so amazingly from going on a low-carb diet, and it started to change their whole perspective. And I want all of you to realize you could be the next pivotal patient to another conventional doctor who may then become low-carb. But I do have some advice, and it's advice that I hope you'll appreciate. First, respect your doctor, even if you strongly disagree with them. Advocate for good data, careful research, and request that they do the same, respectfully. Understand this can take time, and have patience. But, and this is the most important, as always, listen to every productive side of the debate with an open mind. As you probably, those of you who follow me on social media, you know that I'm constantly engaging those people who have a different opinion and genuinely requesting whatever information they can bring, because indeed, I could have missed things that may change my own worldview. Okay, what about the timeliness of science? Because this is also very relevant to us, thinking about it from a citizen science perspective. And I want to bring one of my favorite examples up. Many of you may already know this story. This is Barry Marshall, who himself is a scientist, and he connected with Robin Warren as a pathologist, this was in the 80s, who was interested in gastritis. Together, they developed a hypothesis that peptic ulcers and gastric cancer could have a causal pathway from H. pylori. This was so radical in the 80s because so many people didn't think there was any way it could survive stomach acid. They submitted their initial findings to their peers, and it was received extremely poorly. They were laughed at. It was actually, I think, in the bottom 10% of everywhere they submitted. So basically what happened was in 1984, Marshall got a baseline endoscopy done to confirm no ulcers. And what did he do? Does anyone know? Yes. He then consumed broth containing cultured H. pylori, expecting to develop an ulcer in 1 or more years. Actually, he saw symptoms within days, including nausea, vomiting, and I always mess up that word, but basically bad breath. By day 8, a new endoscopy showed massive inflammation, and a biopsy showed H. pylori had colonized his stomach. Naturally, he and Warren were then immediately lavished with praise, and here's all the awards that he'd gotten immediately following, including a Nobel Prize shortly thereafter. The reason there's some laughter here is because some who know the story knows this slide is exactly false by about 1 decade. The first known award I was able to find was in 1994, fully 10 years after he had demonstrated this change physically with his own body. That's quite astonishing. But on top of that, the Nobel Prize ultimately came in 2005, 19 years after he'd done, 21 years, got to get my math right. And to be sure, I would expect a Nobel Prize to take time to ultimately award, but what was fascinating was, and if you read this story, even after it was demonstrated, it didn't actually change that much of their attention. One scientist who was kind of arguing with me about it tried to look and find something that could refute that and said, well, actually, there does seem to be a new level of interest that showed up about 3 years after he had done that experiment. And he said, that's practically overnight in science. I was like, really? My research is about 3 years old, so I guess I started yesterday. Okay, the moral of the story is that scientific acceptance takes a lot of time. Or does it? Well, hold that thought, because now I want to talk for a second about lean mass hyperresponders, or what I would like to call lean mass hyper-citizen scientists. So, for a recap, for those of you who are not familiar, there are a subset of those people who go on a low-carb diet who will see their total and LDL cholesterol go up. And there's a subset of those who we like to call hyperresponders that are lean mass hyperresponders. They often will tend to have the highest LDL, but it's also matched with a couple of other metrics, which I'll talk about here. They tend to have an LDL of 200 or higher, an HDL of 80 or higher, and triglycerides of 70 or lower. And what do they have in common? I'm going to use the laser just for this one moment. They tend to be very low carb. They tend to have very low body fat. And they tend to be athletic and fit. But this is more observational. Not everybody meets all of these criteria. Bottom line is, this does tend to be what we find that's typical. And I'll show you, because this is the banner for the Lean Mass Hyperresponder Facebook group. If you didn't know any better, you would think that this Facebook group was all based around fitness and trying to get cut. But no, what brought everybody to this Facebook group was actually their lipid numbers, their cholesterol tests. That's quite astonishing. This is one of those lean mass hyperresponders. This is Mick. And that picture of him to the left is actually his after picture, after he had gone paleo. But even after going paleo, he still had a number of problems that he was still trying to resolve. And so eventually he went keto. But as he went keto, he saw that his lipid numbers changed substantially. You want to see how Mick looks today? This is Mick today. And he's in his 60s, by the way. I hope I look half as good as Mick does when I get to my 60s. I don't look that good now. So this, by the way, is Mick doing a pull-up with near perfect form, something he's never been able to do in his life, and I'm actually sure I can do right now. These are his cholesterol numbers. His total cholesterol is 620. His LDL is 492. His HDL is 112, and his triglycerides are 59. Now, to be sure, he's a little more of an outlier. He tends to be a little bit the higher level. But he also exhibits many of those attributes I was telling you about earlier. Very lean, very fit, and he's very low carb. Let me also introduce you to April. Now, unlike Mick, April has actually been an athlete her whole life, but she's kind of just put up with the fact that she would probably be a little more of a padded athlete. She's just never been able to lose enough fat. And that was just something that she came to accept until she'd gone keto, because this is April today. This is another one where it was just a year before. And then this is actually a video of hers, one that I saw posted to Facebook that really showed a difference because, again, this is her just 1 year earlier. And the reason I like this comparison video is because you would have expected, if you saw a still of this, that the person on the left was probably stronger than the person on the right. Not so. She's much stronger and leaner on the right side. And if you look closely, if you watch how much she is breathing and so forth, you can see she just has greater control overall. Her life was radically changed by low carb, but these are her numbers. Total cholesterol 505, LDL of 411, HDL of 76, triglycerides of 89. Both Mick and April and many of the people in the low carb, in the Lean Mass Hyperresponder Facebook group are very adherent and very interested in maintaining this because they feel like it's changed their lives so much. And here's my prediction. My prediction is Lean Mass Hyperresponders will change everything. Everything. Because never has there been a cohort that could test the lipid hypothesis like Lean Mass Hyperresponders. They are truly unique citizen scientists. Kind of like Barry, they're taking on something that might be considered right now to be of extraordinary risk. And I want to emphasize something, this is very important. I'm not making the claim that lean mass hyperresponders are okay. That's part of why we want to be able to study them. But likewise, has there never been a time for which the empowerment for them to find each other and to organize through social media and networking? We started this Facebook group a year ago. I still can't believe this. We're up to 3,200 members. And 92, I just took this screenshot last night. We had 92 this week. That's bananas. I can't believe that. It's low-carb bananas, by the way. The study that I'm speaking of, I believe that it'll change everything. I'm trying to work extremely hard to get a long-term follow-up study for lean mass hyperresponders. People I'm talking to are like Spencer Nadolsky and Ethan Weiss. While I like to say I'm cautiously optimistic about having high LDL for metabolic reasons, they're cautiously pessimistic, but that's not, in my opinion, a bug. That's a feature. I would like for there to be more collaboration, not just between those people of different viewpoints, but yes, between citizen scientists and formal scientists. Just one follow-up study from lean mass hyperresponders could have a seismic shift in our understanding of lipids, metabolism, and mortality risk. Now, what happens when a citizen scientist like me gets a hold of a large data set, like NHANES? What's NHANES? NHANES is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And let me tell you, it was a huge game changer when I was fortunate enough to have Tommy Wood and his team be able to put together a data set for me. They actually did a lot of the legwork in getting it together so that I could then finally get it into a spreadsheet and start playing with it. And I did. Played with it quite a bit. But before I dive in, a few important caveats. This analysis is preliminary, and I'm going to be very upfront. I'm not an epidemiologist or statistician, so this will be quite basic, but then that's what I wanted all along. You know that graph I showed you earlier where it's showing how there's all the digestion that's going on, particularly for the studies. I wanted to look at raw data. I'm an engineer. I want to get under the hood. I want to actually see the process for myself. For that matter, I wanted to see raw data analysis as minimally modified as possible. And that's what I'm going to show you now. All constructive criticism, by the way, is welcome, but emphasis on constructive. So, all the adjustments I made are on this slide, all of them. And they're all, in my opinion, very defensible. First of all, I did, of course, grab everybody who was eligible. That means everybody 18 and up. It goes from, the data set goes from 18 to 85. And then I subtracted everybody who had any missing lipid data. And then finally, the last thing is I subtract everyone who had triglycerides over 400 because the common Friedwald equation, which is the most common one they use to calculate LDL-C, doesn't allow for triglycerides over 400. That's it. And what you end up with is a total of 40,444. Plenty of people. I will tell you, didn't find any lean mass hyperresponders. There were like 2. That's a new phenomenon, of course. So, this is the graph that had me almost fall out of my chair. Basically what I did was I went to try to find age parity, so in comparing against the different LDL groups, they had about the same age, since age is, after all, a risk factor for death. Do kind of want to make sure that's all set up. Okay, but on top of that, I also wanted to get about what the mortality percent was per year, because follow-up times could be different. And as you could see, all the way to the left, the first grouping, 0 through 79 LDL, when their blood was taken and they had this number, they had an average mortality rate of about 3.1% per year. The next one over, that's 80 to 99, it's 2.56. And they basically past that point, it's around 2% per year for everybody above 100 LDL. So being below 100 LDL was associated with higher mortality. Never mind heart disease, cardiovascular disease mortality, or any specific mortality like cancer. We're talking everything, all of the mortality. And so I got excited about this. I turned it around to Tommy. He went further and got us the confidence interval, so you can actually see, for you geeks up here, this is your moment to grab a picture, because you can actually see the harder, deeper data. He is a lot more on the statistician side. But then, of course, I went to look a little bit further. I wanted to actually get to that triad, because I was talking not only about high LDL, I also wanted to see about high HDL and low triglycerides. You can see it improves across every single grouping. I'm going to go back to the prior slide and forward so you can actually see this difference. You see how it improves across the board? Generally speaking, if low-carb diets are helping you improve your HDL and decrease your triglycerides, again, I'm not calling causation, I'm calling correlation. It's correlated with generally a lower mortality. This, by the way, is the population average. For those people over 50 in NHANES, per year, you've got about a 2.3% per year mortality. So those people seeing the higher LDL, they tend to be on the lower end of that. I also did further substratification. Actually, we lose a little more confidence if we substratify, and that's why I kind of had it grouped into 6 in the prior one. So I want to caveat that, but as you can see, those people at the highest LDL, that got measured, but that have the triad, they've not died yet. In fact, they're well below the population average. If you look at this one where I brought the triglycerides down even a little bit more to 80 or less, we now have 7 at the furthest end range. Again, this is starting at LDL of 220 in the existing NHANES data set. These aren't even necessarily low carbers. Going up to 280, you actually have everybody surviving as of right now. Average age over there was 75 and 70. I mean, I can only imagine what their doctors are telling them. So, this is, I actually wanted to do one more thing. I wanted to look at centenarians, because the centenarians were probably the most controversial of the slides that I released on Twitter. And I got a lot of feedback on that. But here's the thing. These are the 5 last confirmed surviving 100-year-olds. Centenarians is century, right? And they all practically have the triad in common. All have an LDL cholesterol at least above 130. And as you can see, one of them has it to 229. They all have above 50 for HDL. And all but one have triglycerides below 100, which, by the way, happens to match the challenge that I have from the low-carb challenge that I had from last year. I was looking for specifically this, 50, 100, and 130. And I was astonished to find just how much this exists in the existing centenarians. Once again, I didn't pick 5 out of random. These are the 5 that are in the enhanced data currently. Now, the reason there's just 5 is because in 1999, this was the earliest point in which they had both lipids and mortality being captured. So all of these had their lipids taken in 1999. This isn't when they're being taken now at age 100. No. In 1999, they had these lipids. 16 years later, they're alive, and they're the only ones alive confirmed in 2015. So here were the criticisms of my analysis, which I have to say I kind of found somewhat amusing. That it was too crude or quick and dirty, that I was lacking proper analysis, and my honest favorite one is that adjusted data is nearly meaningless. Okay, fair enough. I went ahead and started going down because I had this idea. I wanted to actually see if instead of just those for 100 years or older, why not go ahead and look at each of the ages moving down at least for 5 years? Because if I did that all the way down to age 95, so the other tenarians, then I would also have another 10-year span from when they would be confirmed alive in 2015. That would be some pretty interesting data, and I'm going to share that with you now. So this was the 99 tenarians. And as you can see, hey, we do have somebody with a low LDL. But they share this category with two people who have super high LDL, 152 and 187. These are the 98 tenarians. And hey, there's somebody with a 55 LDL, but they share that with everybody 100 and above, including one that actually gets up to 186. These are the 97 tenarians. And of course, now that I have so many people, I need to just throw this in a graph, but I'll make this easy for you. Everybody over here, the 5 bars on the left side, those people have under 100 LDL. Everybody to the right side has over 100. Again, confirmed alive, at least 10 years since they were measured. And now we have everybody who are part of the 96 tenarians, 10 on the left, 22 on the right, which, by the way, match the 95 tenarians. So again, we see this association of higher LDL with lower all-cause mortality. And interestingly, this is not the triad. We're back to just LDL, straight up. Now, here's something that gets brought up a lot. What gets brought up a lot is actually, Dave, you're just looking at reverse causation. That was the one other criticism that came up when I was sharing this data, that really what's happening is you're observing a diseased state right before the person passes away. And that diseased state is what's bringing down their LDL. So of what we've been able to look at, the most common explanation could be when it's associated to some cancers, because there are some cancers that can bring down LDL. But generally speaking, their effect size will last within 5 years. So we excluded everybody who had died within 5 years of having their lipids taken, and looked only at those people who had survived to at least 5 years, and then compared the mortality from that. And this is what it looks like. Of those, there were 9 that were alive, and 57 deceased who had an LDL below 100 for a survival rate of 16%. But for those with an LDL above 100, there were 41 alive, 205 deceased with a survival of 20%. I want to do just one more. I love enhanced data. I could just ruminate in enhanced data. I want to look at triglycerides. Triglycerides stratified against LDL. So it's going to be a 3-dimensional graph. The higher these bars go, the more there's mortality percent per year. And as you can see, with high triglycerides, if you have low LDL, it's actually a fairly high rate pretty much wherever you go. But that's for LDL below 100. Let's now look at triglycerides stratified, the same sextiles stratified against LDL of 100 to 150. That looks like this. And interestingly, particularly to me, you can see that there actually is more of a distinctive curve now. You can actually see as we go from the right side of the higher triglycerides to the left, it's getting smaller. So actually the best group off are those people who have triglycerides under 60. They're looking at a nice 1.46% mortality per year. So how about one last tertiary, where we look at people with an LDL of 150 or above? They look like this. And as you go from right to left, you can see that not only are they beating out all the other classes, but those people with an LDL of 150 or higher who have triglycerides below 60, 1.02% mortality per year. Quite impressive. Actually, seriously, there's so many different ways to cut the enhanced data, but I'm just going to tell you, and this is a little off script, I'm just going to tell you there's so many ways in which I see greater mortality at the lower LDL levels. But again, it's an association. I really want to emphasize that in this next slide. Correlation is not causation. So causing yourself to have higher LDL is not what I'm making the claim will give you greater longevity. But epidemiology, while it isn't ideal for proving causation for a hypothesis, that said, epidemiology is good for pushing back on a hypothesis where correlations are the reverse of expectations. You don't need to be an advanced statistician to understand that. Look, if the centenarians I just showed you were binge drinkers, all of them, Wouldn't that kind of go against your expectations given the science that you've come to understand up to this point? It certainly would for me too. What if they were all 3-pack-a-day smokers? The only surviving centenarians in the NHANES data set. It would make no sense. And it's because having that reverse correlation is something that we naturally want to be looking toward to better understand what's happening. Obviously, this data is very relevant to people going on a low-carb diet because, of course, we're seeing these patterns. We see so many people, just show of hands, those people who have had their LDL and HDL go up and their triglycerides go down, just those 3 directions. Yeah, we have like 2/3 of the room, right. So this is very relevant information because at a minimum, you kind of want to understand the correlation. So in summary, look, this is more about you than it is me. I want you to recognize that there is a place for organizations that we have in our lives. And they really can, they can be useful, but just be mindful that they're populated with humans like us. Humans in an organization, they can often get into a commonality of thought, of theories, and that can be tricky. It can be hard for them to get outside of the box. So appreciate that and understand it. Understand also the difference between formal and citizen science. Each has its advantages and disadvantages, absolutely. And never stop engaging others with different viewpoints that are productive. But, and this is the thing I most want to leave you with, please do not underestimate. This is how important it is. I want to be sure I state it correctly. Do not underestimate your ability to contribute as citizen scientists or be a pivotal patient. If I could ask just one favor, could you give an applause to those people who support our work? Many of them are up here right now, without which we couldn't do nearly the level of research we've been able to do. Both Siobhan and I are very thankful for our members, and that's my speech. Thank you guys so much.
Okay, you've seen Robin, now you get to see Batman. It's Siobhan Huggins with Insulin Beyond Carbohydrates, Putting the Pieces Together. Let's welcome Siobhan.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Siobhan Huggins, and I work with Dave Feldman at cholesterolcode.com, and I might be what Dave would describe as an alternative thinker, for good or for bad. I spend my time researching cholesterol, metabolism, and the immune system, as well as doing a lot of self-experimentation and getting quite a few blood tests along the way. For a quick recap of my history, I weighed 240 pounds at my highest weight in 2015, and just for the record, I am not very tall. I was 19 years old at the time and had a variety of physical health issues as well as depression. In August of 2016, weighing 221 pounds, I went on a ketogenic diet mainly for weight loss. Long story short, I no longer have the health issues I used to, and I lost about 80 pounds along the way. Although, admittedly, these improvements may have been mitigated a tiny bit by my most recent experiment involving lots and lots of carbs, which I'll have a write-up on soon. But even that aside, the improvements with keto and now carnivore have been significant. And as I've learned more about ketogenic diets, nutrition, metabolic syndrome, and chronic disease, I've become more and more interested in insulin and its role in health. Typically, the discussions around insulin in low-carb circles like these have been centered around eating carbs, getting hungry, eating again, and this eventually culminating in sustained high levels of insulin, called hyperinsulinemia, and inevitable weight gain. The proposed solution to this cycle was to reduce carbohydrate and, as a result, reduce insulin levels, and then you lose weight and everything is great. I've also often seen hyperinsulinemia described as the root cause of many issues that plague us today. In fact, some of the risk markers for health issues that we use, even by mainstream measures like high triglycerides and low HDL, can actually be used as a rough proxy for insulin resistance. But the more I learned about this topic, the more I began to wonder if there might be more to the story. For example, why are there societies that eat high carb but don't have high rates of chronic disease? The Ketofest, for example, or the Semaine are the most often cited ones. Perhaps things are more complicated than we might expect. Not only that, but when Okinawa, a culture that was at the very least not traditionally on a ketogenic diet, was introduced to a Western diet, their health rapidly declined from one generation to the next. They went from some of the healthiest to some of the most sick. Considering their diet wasn't necessarily low carb to start, perhaps something other than carbohydrate levels in themselves were lending the next generation to have more health issues than they had before. Beyond insulin's involvement in metabolic disease, I also wondered why people sometimes stalled on ketogenic or even carnivorous diets despite doing everything right. If the problem is just the carb level and hunger, then why does this happen? Even more than that, why do people stall while following a ketogenic diet, sometimes for prolonged periods of time, only to begin losing weight again for seemingly no reason? Has anyone here experienced that or know someone who has? Yeah, exactly. It's confusing and frustrating. In order to figure out how all of these pieces fit together to get a better understanding of what's happening, we first have to understand the keystone, insulin. The initial impression I had about insulin, just by hearing about it in passing, was that it simply pushed glucose into cells by force. The more insulin, the more force behind that push. But, like most things in our body, it's far more elegant than this. Instead of pushing glucose into cells, insulin is more of a factory floor manager, sending the message to allow the next shipment of product to come in to be used or put away. This is an important distinction because if this signaling is interrupted, intentionally or not, it can lead to things like insulin resistance, which is a bit like the manager's connection with his or her team being lost. At one point in time, I thought that this really was the extent of insulin's job. Coordinate glucose usage, okay, we're done, there's no more to learn. But this is actually far from true. Insulin is a hormone that has a far-reaching impact across the entire body, and it actually has a lot of jobs. Of course, the most obvious is its involvement in the uptake of nutrients, but this extends beyond glucose. Insulin helps to store away nutrients like protein and fat as well. For example, in the case of a meal that has both carbohydrates and fat, say like some cauliflower rice with cheese, perhaps, the slight insulin response from the meal results in uptake of amino acids into the muscle so that they can be used, storage of glucose, and storage of fat. All of this is essentially doing the same thing. It's just packing away the energy and materials you don't need right this second, like putting groceries in the fridge so you can have some for tomorrow too. The opposite is also true, which is something that Megan mentioned. Let's say you're following a fasting protocol and don't eat for 36 hours. In that case, your insulin would typically go down, and this results in the release of energy that was previously stored away in order to fuel your body until the next meal comes along. Some of these adaptations actually occur with low-carb diets in general, not just fasting. One such adaptation is sometimes called physiological insulin resistance or adaptive glucose sparing. This happens to ensure only the cells that absolutely require glucose for fuel are using it, while other cells use ketones or fatty acids instead. This is important for situations with very little to no glucose coming in from the diet. If this didn't happen, then your muscle could eat up all the glucose, leaving none for your brain. And this would result in the unfortunate side effect of plummeting blood sugar levels and death. So it's actually quite a wonderful thing. This regulation of energy is likely why insulin is often discussed revolving around weight loss so much. Generally, the way I heard it was that if insulin was high all the time, for example, from eating frequent high-carb meals without sufficient time for insulin to come back down, like Megan talked about, fat could never properly be released from the fat cells and weight gain would be the result. In other words, being stuck in permanent storage mode. But beyond impacting fat and muscle, insulin also impacts a variety of organs as well. As far as energy regulation in the liver, insulin inhibits our ability to get and transport fat from storage and to make new glucose and ketones. The effect is especially important right after a meal. Insulin from a meal is basically signaling that we already have energy coming in because, I mean, we just ate, duh. So there's no need to pull much from storage. Doing so would make as much sense as ordering a home delivery steak, for example, only to eat what you already have in your fridge instead. Insulin helps us make smart decisions with what we do with energy, putting away things when it makes sense and taking them out as it makes sense. Insulin also helps the brain use glucose for fuel, which is a great thing. We need that. And insulin resistance in the brain has been implicated as insulin resistance in the brain has been implicated as an early warning sign of Alzheimer's disease, which is something that Amy Berger has talked about a lot. Basically, the cells in the brain start to struggle because they can't get enough food. They can't get the energy that they need. Not only that, the high insulin prevents clearance of certain proteins in the brain, which can become plaque, something often seen in relation to Alzheimer's disease as well. In other words, this information pretty much matched what I had been generally hearing from the community. Insulin helps us regulate energy. High insulin blocks using our own fat, and even the brain needs it to use glucose for energy. It did a few other things, but whatever. For the most part, it was pretty simple. I can go home. I can quit thinking about it. But I still hit a snag. I didn't understand how this related to disease. If insulin is all about energy regulation, why is it involved in Alzheimer's disease in a way that has nothing to do with energy? Not to mention its role in many other modern diseases. My first hint actually came from a man called Ivor Cummins. You may recognize this slide if you've seen some of his talks before. This is his 10 levers slide, and all of the levers relate to behavior that can impact insulin levels, but many of them don't actually have anything to do with carbohydrate. This was really curious, but it made me realize that there may be a hidden side to insulin usage beyond just energy. Before long, I also found another thing that insulin was involved in. Infection obviously wasn't on Ivor's slide because it's generally transient and not really related to lifestyle. But it turned out that infection could result in temporary hyperinsulinemia, high insulin, and insulin resistance. Infection causes this. This immediately interested me, and I decided to focus on it further in hopes of getting information untainted by biases against obesity that are often tied to insulin resistance research. Generally, they say it's caused by obesity. Whether it was related to infection or not, insulin related to disease was often marked by high levels of insulin and higher levels of inflammation as well. This set it apart from the adaptive glucose sparing I mentioned earlier, and this suggested a different context was involved. And this may relate to the fact that prolonged high insulin itself sends a message to our immune system. Some immune cells, when exposed to high levels of insulin for an extended amount of time, can have their abilities cranked up into overdrive. These abilities can range from being better able to clear debris during infection, or even increasing their ability to fight off viruses directly. It's really good for them in that case. At the same time, if the immune cells have been cleaning up damaged LDL, for example, they can accumulate cholesterol. It appears that insulin and inflammation in general inhibits the ability of these same immune cells to spit out the cholesterol they collect, and that's a process called cholesterol efflux. Essentially, it seems that the higher insulin allows the immune cells to clean up things that may be harmful if left in the bloodstream, and they won't go about releasing what's left until the coast is clear and things have settled down a bit. In these papers, in the context of fighting off viruses and bacteria, they speculated this accumulation of cholesterol may be helpful during infection. As one of the things that immune cells can do with it is they can use it for building blocks to create tools that they use to fight against infection. So it's really helpful for them to have that on hand. It makes sense for them to hold on to it until they're really, really sure that they won't need it anymore. Interestingly, the accumulation of cholesterol in immune cells is actually also what we see in heart disease. How curious. Perhaps the immune cells in both cases are doing their intended job, with the main difference being that with heart disease, this process just keeps on going for years and years and years with no downtime to clean up things and return it to normal. This is obviously only one small part to heart disease, but I did find the similarities quite interesting. Beyond affecting immune cells directly, pathological insulin resistance in the liver can also happen during infection. If severe enough, triglycerides, VLDL, and glucose production will all go up, while our ability to make ketones will go down. And you can actually test this yourself. If you get sick, just test your blood sugar and ketones. In other words, you'd end up with someone who might look pretty close to someone with metabolic syndrome or diabetes. The first thought might be that all these things are bad and we need to get rid of this ability to happen during infections because it's really dangerous, but it's actually the opposite. They may actually help us during infection. The lipoproteins we make can be used to bind to pathogens, and that's something I spoke about here last year. And the glucose we make during infections is also used by immune cells for fuel and to make tools that they use to kill pathogens. All with the help of insulin resistance. The high glucose from infection is quite similar to the high glucose of diabetes as well. Generally, I heard that high glucose was coming from eating carbs, but they actually decided to look at this. When you compare non-diabetics, it turned out the problem wasn't with ingested glucose or with getting rid of it. In fact, clearance by muscle was increased in diabetics, not decreased. So where was this glucose coming from? Exactly as we see in infection, actually, it's just that their own production of glucose in the liver isn't properly suppressed by insulin as it normally would be, so they keep cranking out more and more even when they eat and it's supposed to go down. As a result, the additional glucose they're eating stacks on top of what they're making, resulting in high fasting or postprandial glucose. And this is exactly what we see in infection as well. And as I mentioned, this is a possible sign of insulin resistance in the liver. And again, appears to be a case of something helpful for the immune system in crisis, but is continuing on for years. These associations between symptoms of modern disease, high insulin, and immune responses appeared again and again. Another example was with Alzheimer's, where the material that makes up the plaque in the brain of people with Alzheimer's turns out to be antiviral and antibacterial, and also may be helpful during brain injury. Removing it also increases death from infection and cancer in animal models. They speculate in this paper that these components of the plaque in the brain may be a part of the immune response to stress or other harmful things to our brain. And its accumulation is a marker of disease, but it does not cause it. That's a very important distinction. It may be that in the short term it may be protective, but if it continues on for years, it may be a sign of a major problem that isn't getting resolved. In other words, persistently high insulin was resulting in something that was beneficial during infection yet again. This has become a common problem, a common thing that I keep seeing, a common pattern. All of this suggests that beyond carbs, hyperinsulinemia could also be caused as a downstream effect of the immune system at work. It may be that something we're doing may be sending the message that there's work to be done all the time, and this never goes away. Perhaps because there is something that isn't getting resolved or is actively ongoing. Blaming insulin for causing these things would be like blaming an ambulance for people being hurt whenever it shows up, when in fact it's there to help with the problem. Just because the immune system is involved doesn't necessarily mean it has to do with infection all the time. Our immune system does many things, and those jobs can have overlapping tools or pathways. They may use the same thing for multiple different things. So it can be difficult to tell when it's being used for what context and what is it actually reacting to, and it can make things really confusing. For example, it has been speculated that heart disease is caused by infection because pathways used during infection are also seen in heart disease. Because insulin is involved in both immunity and energy regulation, this also applies to situations where we see it present, that we could confuse two things even though it's just one thing being used for multiple things. So far, we can now tell that insulin signaling is involved in energy regulation, but also infection, where it helps to provide materials that our immune cells can use and helping them do their job better. But what about those other aspects of the immune system that I just mentioned? Does this mean that insulin is also involved in repair? It turns out that this could very well be the case. It is apparently known that acute injuries result in insulin resistance, and they refer to this as critical illness diabetes or diabetes of injury. This could be another example of the immune system at work as it goes about its repair job, trying to recover from the damage and using insulin resistance to get that job done. But this process may actually take a very long time. This is true for severe burns as well. And what fascinated me about this paper in particular was that the insulin resistance from that initial injury didn't continue for a day or two. It went on for 3 years in some cases because of how severe that injury was. Possibly this time span is signifying how long it took them to heal from the injuries enough that insulin resistance was no longer needed for that repair. And at Low Carb Denver, I also heard it mentioned by Sarah Hallberg that in her experience at Virta, the longer someone was diabetic, the more likely it was that it would take them longer to come off of diabetic medication, even with a strict ketogenic diet. And sometimes that meant several years. This may mean that, like the burn victims, we're seeing a repair process take place. The more damage, the longer the time span needed to resolve, even after the initial problem has been taken away, like you've improved your diet. It may be that it's not as simple as eating too many carbs and those carbs causing high insulin and the high insulin causing insulin resistance. It might just be that there's more to it. It's also possible that this insulin resistance is actually just a sign of an underlying problem, such as constantly occurring damage from maybe something you're eating. Or perhaps, as Dave Feldman has speculated, it could be related to impaired healing as well. So you still have that problem, you can't quite fix it, and you're still trying to, so it just keeps going. Either way, this would explain why people following traditional diets that are higher carb don't seem to result in metabolic syndrome, but Western diets do. In order to trigger the insulin resistance, the diet would have to sustain the immune system. It does appear to be the case that once you start going down the road of metabolic syndrome, the ability to tolerate glucose is altered, as shown by Kraft testing, which you might have seen before. And perhaps this is actually a sign of ongoing activity of the immune system from trying to deal with something that's happening. If you keep doing whatever was causing the problem, such as continuing the same diet, it would make sense if it didn't improve. Like doing the same thing over and over is definition of insanity. Or it could also get worse over time. Just like it wouldn't be surprising if a fire started to cause more and more damage to your house, even if you had the fire sprinklers going off all day and night, if what you had on hand wasn't enough to deal with the fire, or if you temporarily put it out only for it to start up again when you next cooked something, this would be a pretty bad situation to be in until you fixed whatever was causing the fire in the first place. But this brings to mind a question. Aren't metabolic issues caused by obesity? How many of you have heard this before, that you're just diabetic because you became overweight and that's the only reason? Generally, the idea that I got was obesity or overnutrition result in inflammation and insulin resistance in our fat, and that causes disease. This is how I used to view it. But there's a problem with this explanation. On Friday night, I actually sent out a tweet asking if any low-carb doctors had seen the opposite. Signs of metabolic derangement resolving before significant weight loss. And many of them responded back that, yeah, sure, this isn't unusual, I see it all the time, describing dramatic changes that they saw even if the patient hadn't lost any weight. In one case on there, a 3-pound weight loss in one of my patients brought blood sugar down from 220 to less than 100 consistently with no medication changes. 3 pounds. This isn't exclusive to anecdote either, though. In this study, which was actually published, I believe, last month, each group you see is comprised of the same people on different diets, and the study was designed to ensure that they wouldn't lose weight regardless of what diet they were on. You wouldn't expect to see any of them resolve metabolic syndrome if they didn't lose any weight, but actually quite a few did. And actually, the ones who did the most were in the low-carb diet group. Imagine that. So perhaps it isn't the weight loss that resolves their issues. Perhaps low-carb and ketogenic diets help, not because they help us lose weight necessarily, but because they remove something in the diet that's causing us to need an activated immune system all the time in order to help us. Or because something in the diet is preventing us from getting better as well as we normally would. It's also possible that in certain situations, our defenses in the gut, for example, may be compromised, resulting in increased sensitivity and immune reaction to things we'd normally be able to handle just fine. This is the case for some carnivores who find that they respond to plants in the diet more severely than some of you would. This may mean that even eating a ketogenic diet for people who experience this may not be enough to see full resolution of their health problems. I mean, Amber is in the audience, she experienced this. But perhaps carnivorous diets aren't helpful for some because they contain less carbs, but because they actually help us to create an environment where proper repair can take place and insulin resistance can eventually resolve. Maybe this also means that weight loss stalls on ketogenic diets aren't always because you're eating too much or doing something wrong. Perhaps there is actually sustained levels of high insulin as a result of repair that's going on in the background. Remember the burn injury folks who had sustained insulin resistance during their recovery. Perhaps coming back from extremely poor health from a standard American diet is actually similar to that in a way. This would mean that obesity and weight gain may be a symptom, not a cause of disease. It's possible that if insulin is high enough due to major repair being needed, then this may lead to weight gain in the first place. On the flip side, if the repairs are still in progress, it could lead to weight loss stalls, even as the person's health improves, as they see non-scale victories and other improvements. If so, then assuming all the criteria for repair are met, a proper functioning immune system so you can repair things, materials to use to replace what's broken, low irritants, and time, the resolution should follow. If not, you may get stuck in limbo where there's an issue needing to be addressed, but the environment may not be that great for dealing with it. Until you fix the environment, the problems will continue, and health improvements may be delayed. Similarly, if a new challenge presents itself that must be dealt with, the same might happen. I had heard anecdotes of this myself, of people who faced family tragedy or job loss or some huge amount of stress and found that their weight loss had stalled, even though they were eating the exact same things as before. And they felt terrible about it. But this could just be due to the chronic stress, which is another contributor to insulin resistance. And speaking of challenges, I may have experienced a mini version of this during a recent experiment. Throughout, I was eating a higher fat carnivore diet, and I was steadily losing weight over the period of about 3 weeks. But about midway in, I got a pretty bad cold, and my weight loss paused, remaining exactly the same until I got better. I wasn't sick anymore, and I immediately started losing weight again. Perhaps something in our environment, likely our diet, considering it gets better when we change that, could cause a situation like this, but instead of resolving, it becomes more and more dire, resulting in long-standing metabolic disruption and disease we see today, and disease that many of us have personally suffered from. Even once you take whatever is causing it away, it may still require time and patience and sufficient fuel and materials to properly repair as you recover from decades of built-up damage. And this doesn't just apply to weight loss either. Any disease where high insulin is involved, it may apply to that too. It may not be able to resolve until whatever is causing the high insulin is also resolved. Ultimately, this would imply that insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia aren't necessarily the drivers of disease, although they may cause some of the symptoms that we see. It may actually be that both of these are acting as a part of our immune system to help us defend against or repair something that could be causing us trouble. This quote from a study on Alzheimer's stuck with me when I read it, so I wanted to share it with you as well. Hopefully, moving forward, we can all strive to understand the purpose of symptoms we're seeing instead of just seeing them as bad things, so we can better understand where the real problem is so that we can fix it and help people. Perhaps we could even begin to see insulin resistance as a potential ally trying to keep us safe until we can fix things for ourselves. I wanted to give a quick thank you to patrons at this point. They helped make this presentation possible, and I really do appreciate it. And I wanted to thank you for coming here.
Thanks, Siobhan. And now we've got some bloke. Some dude, Ricardo Mauricio or something. And after that, lunch.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm going to try to use this. Where am I? Yeah, please. Okay, let me just make sure that my click is working. I have a laser pointer. Yes. It's because it's not plugged in, yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk today about a paradox. It's a paradox of why the fat man is hungry. It's the paradox of the man who evidently has fuel to burn but is still getting low energy signals. This is a picture of me in 2014, just before I went ketogenic. I was 44 kilograms heavier then, and this fella's going to join me on this presentation, and we're going to see a lot of him. So, do you see the paradox? Hunger is a signal that we're running out of energy. And yet, the fat man has evidently got plenty of energy. You can see it on his body. You know, I like paradoxes. They're a good thing. They let you see that possibly some of your dogma, some of the things that your underlying assumptions may be incorrect. I'll give you a good example of one. For example, this one's close to our heart, the diet-heart hypothesis. The diet-heart hypothesis goes something like this. Saturated fat is associated with increased LDL cholesterol. And LDL cholesterol is associated with cardiovascular disease. So you can see the assumptions. We assume these things are both true. We assume there's a bunch of things about this that we're assuming are true. And if we connect the dots, we can see that eating saturated fat definitely must cause heart disease. Saturated fat intake is associated with heart disease. And it's not just me saying this. This is the American Heart Association. This is pulled off their website today. And you can see down the bottom, eating foods that contain saturated fat raises the level of cholesterol in your blood. High levels of LDL cholesterol in your blood increase your risk of heart disease and stroke. These are the experts. And then there's the French. The French paradox. The French happen to eat a lot of saturated fat because they eat a lot of butter and cream and everything. And the French have some of the lowest cardiovascular disease rates in Europe. So, you know, there's a paradox. How is it possible that the first three statements are correct and the second two statements are correct? So a paradox means that some of your underlying assumptions may be wrong. They basically warn us that something about our dogma is incorrect. Maybe the French are just different. Maybe it's just the French being French. Or maybe it's something in the wine, resveratrol or some other chemical that only the French eat that protects them against cardiovascular disease. Or maybe the LDL associated with saturated fat in the diet is different from the LDL that's associated with cardiovascular disease. And I go into this in the first chapter of my book on why the fat man is hungry, and that's available online now immediately for everybody at this conference. So just go to fatmanhungry.com/ketofest and you can download the first chapter, and it's all about these paradoxes and how we can use them to see if our underlying assumptions may be incorrect. So let's go back to our fat man. So we know hunger is a signal that we're running out of energy, and we know that a fat man has evidently plenty of energy. One or more of these assumptions must be wrong. Hunger, now that's a signal that we're running out of energy. So what are the common assumptions about hunger? Oh, it's gluttony, or it's sloth, or lack of discipline, or maybe it's hyperpalatability, the food's just too tasty. Or maybe it's hyper-processing, where we're refining all of these foodstuffs to the point where they do damage to us. Or maybe people just aren't getting enough nutrients and they just have to keep eating until they get all of the nutrients that they need. Or maybe people live in food deserts where, you know, they only have caloric sources and no nutrients. And the final one is maybe it's just carbs making me hungry. It's something in my food that's making me hungry. Well, the first three are really a moral crisis, and I've never liked the explanation of a moral crisis because it's a supernatural explanation. It's very unsatisfying and it's really a lazy way of looking at the problem. It has to be something more than that because 53% of Americans 88% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy and 53% have type 2 diabetes. And that's happened in just the last 20 or 30 years. And so it's not possible that all of a sudden over half of America has a moral crisis. Hyperpalatability and hyperprocessing are both naturalistic fallacies. Oh, you know, it's because we're modern and we've been fiddling with this food for way too much, and that's made us really sick. Some of these things may have small impacts, but I doubt any of them have a major role to play here. Not enough nutrients. Well, this is a man, I don't know if you know who Joel Robuchon is. He passed away recently, but he was at one point the greatest chef of the century, last century. I don't know if you know about Michelin stars, but the best chefs in the world, a very small coterie of them, have one Michelin star. And then very, very, very special chefs in that group may have 2. And only the greatest chefs in the world have 3 Michelin stars. Joel Robuchon had 32. Now he had metabolic syndrome. One of the meals that he was expert in, he made mashed potato with just 3 ingredients: mashed potato, butter, and cream, and no other chef could replicate it, and he would make other chefs cry. The food was so spectacular. But he certainly had access to the best produce of any kind possible, and there is a man who is not in a food desert or lacking nutrient, and yet he had metabolic syndrome, and when he went on a low-carbohydrate diet, it was low for a Frenchman. He dropped 60 pounds. Clearly, it's not the man is not lacking nutrients. And really, if micronutrition was the cause of diabetes, then a multivitamin would cure diabetes, which it clearly does not. So it's hardly a nutrient deficiency. It may have a slight role, but it certainly isn't the major role. And then this last one, carbs make me hungry. Let's table that for now. I promise we'll get back to that. Okay, so that's one part of the picture, hunger. Hunger is a fuel signal. We need energy. The other part of the picture is a fat man has clearly plenty of energy. This is 2014 Richard. His body weight was 150 kilograms, or roughly 330 pounds. I'm guessing at my fat mass at that point because my lean mass currently is around about 83 kilograms, so I'm guessing maybe it might have been 70 kilograms. We'll use that as a guesstimate, roughly 154 pounds of body fat. My available energy was clearly 70 kilograms multiplied by 1,000 grams per kilogram, multiplied by the Atwater factor for fat, which is 9 kilocalories per gram. So obviously, I had 630,000 kilocalories at my disposal. The clicker's not working all of a sudden. There we go. But how much of that potential energy can I access? For example, can we use all of that energy at once? This is actually something that my professor of biochemistry at university this year made a comment. You know, fat is an essentially limitless energy store that we can access instantaneously without having to go through all the hoops and rigmarole of raising insulin to be able to metabolize glucose, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'll give you a good example. A stick of dynamite is roughly 478 kilocalories of energy. A stick of dynamite releases all of its energy immediately. 2014 Richard is roughly 1,318 sticks of dynamite. So evidently we can't access all of this energy immediately, or if a fat man went for a run, he might likely self-combust. So there must be some rate limit involved in how fast we can get energy out of body fat. So just seeing a fat man doesn't necessarily mean he's able to produce adequate calories. I'm going to mention a study here. This was done by Seymour Alpert, and it is a study looking at some of Ansel Keys' starvation studies from the post-Second World War era, where they were taking conscientious objectors. They were feeding them the kinds of foods that you'd be able to grub up in post-war Europe, things like starchy tubers and salted beef and things like this. It wasn't a great diet, but it was a semi-starvation diet. They gave these men 1,500 calories a day to eat, and they were basically moderating the amount of calories they had so that they guaranteed a 20% weight loss. And it's a fascinating study, but Seymour Alpert was a astrophysicist who had an interest in biochemistry, and he'd done pre-med, so he wasn't out of the field. And he from Arizona, and unfortunately passed away just a couple of years ago from a botched surgery. But he went back to the data and looked at the point where these people in starvation in a long-term study, the point at which their fat mass started to fail to be able to deliver energy, so that they were forced to recruit the fat-free mass or lean tissue for energy. So he was looking at what point do these guys start losing lean mass, and then that's clearly the point where the fat, that's the rate limit for fat. Okay, so he came up with the value of 290 kilojoules per kilogram per day. So the more fat you have, the more energy you can produce from fat. It's roughly about 1% of your fat cells will release roughly 1% of their energy per day. The interesting thing here is that you'll see here that limited capacity of the fat store to compensate for energy deficiency results in an immediate decrease in the fat-free mass. So this is the point where we're not getting enough energy at the rate that we need from body fat. Now we're having to recruit, we're going to have to, and he also talks about reduction in the metabolic rate at a linear rate to recruitment of lean tissue to use for energy. And in the cases of a less severe dietary deficiency, the fat-free mass will not be depleted. So what he's essentially saying there is, if you have enough body fat to fully provide your energy for the day, you don't have to recruit lean mass you don't have to waste lean mass for energy. You can use it for more important purposes like structure. Okay, so let's have a look at, so I have, Richard in 2014 had 630,000 kilocalories, but of that, I had roughly 70 kilograms by 2.2 kilograms per pound it's roughly 31.5 kilocalories per pound of body fat per day that a pound of body fat can produce. So if you have 1 pound of body fat, you can produce 31 calories a day. If you have 10 pounds, you can produce 300. I could produce 4,851 kilocalories of energy per day. So obviously I have plenty of energy. I'm probably only using 2,500 to 3,000, somewhere in this range. The only way to know this is to test this off. But you know so clearly, Fat Richard there has plenty of body fat to go for the day, through a day of energy use. Okay, so what else can affect how much energy we can draw out of body fat? Well, Siobhan's already spoken about insulin. Insulin will further affect how much energy we can apparently draw from body fat. This is a meme that I created some time ago. It was actually from an article by Jeff Volek in Men's Health magazine. And basically what I did was the numbers along the bottom is how much insulin in picomoles per litre, and that's not a unit that we generally use. So I added the milli international units per litre on the top row. So you can see that somebody who has, for example, somebody who has 14.5 fasting insulin is almost unable to pull energy out of body fat. But somebody who has, say, 2 or 3 is able to produce a lot of energy from body fat. So obviously we know insulin is going to affect how much energy we can draw from that 4,800 and whatever calories that I had for the day. This data was from Jensen et al. This is where it actually came from. I dug in for the actual study underneath. And this study actually looked at type 2 diabetics and normal people. And you can see normal people is that curve that Jeff Volek's article had. And then diabetics are on this curve here. And you can see that diabetics have their insulin is up in this range. And so they have this leeway where they can get a little bit of fat energy out of body fat. So that's certainly interesting. So we're going to get less energy from body fat than it appears from a fat person, based on how much insulin they've got flowing in their system. So insulin regulates the availability of fat from the source, being body fat. Let's assume we're fasting, we're not eating any food, we're not eating any energy, we're just eating the energy off our body. Because this is the argument. Why doesn't a fat man just not eat? He shouldn't be hungry. Okay, so insulin also regulates availability of the fuel at the sink. The source is where the energy is coming from. The sink is where the energy is actually being used. And this is a quick and dirty example, explanation of how fat moves around the body. It's way more complicated than this. I'm sure Dave's got some plenty better slides on this. But essentially, I like to think of this as fat being on the top. And the fat cell is storing the energy, and the energy runs downhill in the form of non-esterified fatty acids attached to albumin, and it's basically going through the system to all of the cells in the periphery, like muscle cells, for example, that are going to utilize this energy source. And what isn't used by the body ends up at the liver, and the liver then packages these back up into VLDLs and sends them back up. And in the process, it can go past some of these cells that can also draw energy out of the VLDLs. But its final destination is at the fat cell, who's responsible for hoovering it all up and holding on to it. And so this is a cycle that is running all of the time. So we did a Ketofest in Australia in Canberra, and we tested Carl on a respiratory exchange ratio machine. So he had to put this device in his mouth and breathe through it and not talk, and this was a chance for me to get a word in edgewise. So I got up and did the presentation. So the interesting thing about this is that we can actually, this test was done by Metabolic Health Systems, and they're in the process of getting FDA approval in the US, but they have approval in Europe and approval in Australia. It's a box about the size of a shoebox, and it measures oxygen that you breathe in, oxygen that you breathe out, that is the oxygen you didn't use in that breath, and also the CO2 you breathe out. And from those, it can work out what your metabolic rate is precisely, and it can also work out what fuel you're burning. If you're burning glucose, your metabolic rate will be your respiratory exchange ratio will be 1.0. And if you're, so here's a poster presentation that this company did, and you can see that if your respiratory exchange ratio, or respiratory quotient, as sometimes called, is 1.0, these people are burning only glucose, and if it's 0.7, then you're burning only fat. But you can see, and these are people on the pink axis, on the pink line, or the area under the curve. The pink line is people who've been fasted for 10 to 16 hours. So these are people who should be running only on fat, and yet clearly they're unable to. What's actually happening is that they're burning. The majority of people. These are people who are overweight. And you can see the BMI of the cohort. Everybody's over 25. 20 of these people are over 45 BMI. And you can see that these metabolically unhealthy people are not able to burn fat. They're throwing anything they can on the fire. They're burning amino acids. They're burning any glucose that's around. If they're a low-carb person, they're probably down on the lower end of things, because they probably don't have large amounts of glucose from the meal that they had 16 hours ago, but these are people who are metabolically unhealthy and unable to burn body fat. Here's the thing, fat men just don't oxidize fatty acids very well. So that's an interesting question. Why is that then? Well, one of the things is when we make fat in our cells, in our hepatocytes, in our liver cells, when we make fat, our liver cells shut off the ability to burn fat. And that makes sense, because what they're doing is, their job is to take excess energy and export it out to cells that are responsible for storing or using excess energy. So the hepatocytes will essentially, I just went one too far. Yeah. What happens? This is a picture of a hepatocyte, a liver cell, and inside this cell is the mitochondria. This is the engine where everything all happens. And coming into this cell are sources of energy, glucose and long-chain fatty acids. We're not going to worry about the short chains because they have a different pathway. But you'll notice that there is a shuttle here called carnotyl palmitoyl transferase 1, and it is responsible for shuttling these long-chain fatty acids across the mitochondrial outer and inner membranes into the mitochondria so that they can be beta oxidized. This is where fats are being burned in the cell. Okay, so glucose is a water-soluble. It doesn't have any problem getting across the bilipid membrane. It can go straight in, and it can go straight into the Krebs cycle here. It is basically quickly converted into the generic fuel that both fatty acids, amino acids like alanine and glucose are all converted into. This is the universal currency of energy, and then what happens is this goes into the TCA cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle, and what happens is this creates ATP, which is it's their little batteries that store energy ready for use. So the interesting thing here is that there's a citrate shuttle that will shuttle citrate out of the cell, and it doesn't always happen when there's an abundance of citrate. This is one of the things I learned in biochemistry. I used to think A happened, then B happened, then C happened, then D happened, but what actually happens is all of them happen at the same time, and they all have different rate limits. So this is happening all the time. We have citrates coming out of the cell into the cytosol. It's being converted back into acetyl-CoA, and then this enzyme called acetyl-CoA carboxylase, or ACC. This enzyme is the first step from taking that energy that's in the cytosol in the form of acetyl-CoA and turning it into something called malonyl-CoA, which eventually, what happens is there's a complicated machinery here that adds on lots of acetyl-CoAs to make a palmitic acid, a long-chain fatty acid. So this is the process here of taking energy from the Krebs cycle before it's been, from taking fuel from the Krebs cycle before it's been turned into energy and turning it into a different kind of fuel. And I always assumed this only happens when glucose is high. I always assumed, oh, well, we're going to turn glucose into fat when we don't need any energy. But that actually may not be exactly that may not exactly be true. But what happens when we're making this malonyl CoA? This is the first step to making new fats. You probably heard it called de novo lipogenesis. This is the pathway of de novo lipogenesis. This malonyl CoA inhibits the carnitine shuttle. And this is the process where we make fat. It inhibits getting any fatty acids into the mitochondria to use for energy. So what happens here is now your mitochondria is going to be relying on other sources of energy if they're available. And that will be interesting in a minute. So acetyl-CoA carboxylase, this is this enzyme that's, when it's activated, it switches us from burning to making fat. Okay, so one of the interesting things is that insulin promotes the creation of this enzyme. So I spent some time doing genetics this year, and we looked at how the body makes, what the body does with DNA. Most people think of protein as a macronutrient, or maybe it's a structural component of your cells. The precise explanation of what protein is protein is what we make from DNA. We take DNA here, we transcribe the DNA into something called RNA, and then we take this RNA transcript and we translate that into a series of amino acids in something called a polypeptide. That's how we make proteins. And enzymes are proteins. This acetyl-CoA carboxylase is an enzyme. It's a protein that we make from this DNA instructions. Well, here's the interesting thing. Insulin promotes and activates this particular sequence of DNA. So what happens is, here's a study showing that acetyl-CoA carboxylase gene, its expression is regulated by high amounts of glucose, but it's also regulated by high amounts of insulin. And when you think about it, in a normal person, those two things should happen at the same time. But for somebody who's severely insulin resistant, they may not have a lot of glucose in their cell because of their insulin resistance, but they have insulin triggering all of the these effects. And so this actually increases the amount of this enzyme by 4-fold. So high insulin means you have more of this enzyme, so there's more chances for that particular reaction to occur, and for malonyl-CoA to be created, and now you're shutting down the ability to get fat in your mitochondria, and now you can't use fat for energy. Insulin also, all these enzymes have triggers that will turn them on or turn them off based on, for example, the product of the reaction may turn the enzyme off when there's enough of the product around. That makes a lot of sense. Well, insulin actually dephosphorylates this particular enzyme, activating it. It'll sit around forever when there's no insulin, waiting for activation. It will be benign. But as soon as insulin comes into the system, now you're dephosphorylating that enzyme, you're activating it, and now you're making fat. And you have 4 times the amount than somebody who has low insulin. And so insulin is now crimping the sink for fatty acids as energy. So we know insulin promotes the transcription. It also dephosphorylates. Activated acetyl-CoA carboxylase now diverts fuel, this acetyl-CoA, from turning into energy to make malonyl-CoA and make new fuel. And malonyl-CoA eventually becomes a new fatty acid, and you can see that there is the point where it's inhibiting the ability to utilize more fatty acids for energy. So it's malonyl-CoA is inhibiting the shuttling of fatty acids into the mitochondria to be utilized for energy. The other thing is I wanted to try and find some studies that gave us an understanding of the scope of this. I mean, this is all theoretical, and it might be that this produces a small amount of inhibition that cycles on and off so rapidly that you may as well not be inhibited. So I wanted to see if I could find any studies that would give us the scope of this. Now, this study into rats found that rats' rate constant of inhibition by malonyl-CoA of this carnitine-palmitoyl transferase shuttle is 50-fold. It's 50 times greater. What that means is diabetic rats are making 50 times more new fat all the time than non-diabetic rats. And so they're not able to get this in. We think of fuel being energy. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe fuel is being diverted to make new fuel instead of being used for energy. So, humans with metabolic syndrome, the latest study from Jeff Volek, which Siobhan just mentioned, and I expect Dr. Finney, who will be coming up after lunch, will talk about as well. This is the Hyde et al. Study. So this study, an interesting thing about this is they were looking at markers of de novo lipogenesis in these subjects that were going through a low carb, moderate carb, and a high carb version of the diet. And you'll see that this is the amount of this particular fatty acid. It's called palmitoleic acid. It's actually, palmitic acid is what we normally make, but one of the but we have an enzyme that will desaturate one of the carbon bonds at bond 7. So it makes a monounsaturated fatty acid called palmitoleic acid. We can pick up this in the blood, and that will tell us how much de novo lipogenesis, how much making of fat is happening. Now, these people all had, at the beginning of the study, they all had metabolic syndrome. They all had at least 3 of the 5 signals of biomarkers of metabolic syndrome. And you'll see that the people on you can probably work out which one is the high carb diet. This is the high carb diet here. Here's the moderate carb diet, and here's the low carb diet. But you see everybody's making fat all the time. The difference between being a high carb and a low carb in this scenario is a small amount extra fat that you're making when you're on a high carb diet. And you'll see, I mean, this has all been normalized, so we can't actually see the raw data, but it'd be interesting to see what the raw data was for these without being normalized to see. I have a suspicion that people on a high fat, low carb diet who have metabolic syndrome are still making a lot of fuel from fuel instead of making energy from fuel. I should mention, I'm just a university student. I'm a second-year university student, so I could be wrong about all of this stuff. But I found it interesting, and I'm basically found a few studies to give me a bit of a basis on this. So here's the dogma. So here's the dogma. We assume fuel is energy. We see somebody with the fuel all over their body, and we assume they have energy to burn. But what if the fat man is not turning fuel into energy, but it's instead turning fuel into more fuel? And he's continually running out of energy. That would explain why he's hungry. It would explain why he's lethargic. And why is this? Because his insulin is chronically high. His highs are high and his lows are high. He has no nadir to go into a fasted cycle. So essentially, fat men make more insulin. Type 2 diabetic men make more insulin, and they make it no matter what they eat, pretty much. There's a study here by Frank Nuttall and Mary Gannon, actually two studies. They studied diabetic and non-diabetic people challenged with various macronutrients. One was with 50 grams of glucose, one was with 50 grams of protein, and one was a mix of 50 grams glucose and protein. So here are the normal people, and this is pretty much what we'd expect. Protein is really low. We think of course protein needs an insulin. So this is the amount of insulin that they're responding to after the challenge and for the duration. And the area under the curve is the total amount of insulin. So you can see with protein, it's really quite small. When we think of protein being roughly half the insulin response to glucose, and you can see here that glucose is really quite high, and then protein plus glucose is about the same as glucose. And we can see the area under the curve there. The area under the curve for protein is 22. The area under the curve for glucose is 78. So it's roughly 4 times. So a normal person makes roughly 4 times more insulin when they eat carbohydrates than they do when they eat protein. Let's have a look at a type 2 diabetic. Well, firstly, the normal people have their insulin returned to baseline by 4 hours. The type 2 diabetic is still high after 5 hours. Look at protein and look at glucose. The area under the curve of those two is almost the same. Here's the type 2 diabetic here. There's the amount of insulin they produce when they eat glucose. There's the amount of insulin they produce when they eat protein. So a type 2 diabetic is making almost as much insulin from a protein challenge as they are from a glucose challenge. And then, of course, this is crazy time with glucose and protein, everything goes crazy. So this is showing that somebody who has metabolic syndrome is behaving entirely different in response to the food. Okay, so I'd like to finish with talking about the body weight set point. This is something called metabolic adaptation, and it's one of the seminal studies in this was by Rudolf Leibel. And what he did was he took people and measured their metabolic rate, and then half of the people he overfed them, made them eat more food until they had increased their body weight by 10%. And he was able to see where their metabolic rate started at 2100, and the metabolic rate at the end of the process was 2400. And then for people who, the other half, they had the poorer side of the picture. They had to eat less food every day until they lost 10% of their body weight, and you'll see that their metabolic rate dropped. And then he took an even smaller group and forced them to go 20% below their starting rate, and you can see the metabolic rate dropped even further. And the hypothesis here, the theory of this case, is that your metabolic rate is based around the size of your body, okay? And that kind of makes sense. And so what it means is that your body's homeostasis is here, and your body really wants to be here, but if you have more energy and you're storing more energy than available, your body increases your metabolic rate so that you drop back down to... So it's a way of sabotaging your diet or sabotaging your overeating by forcing you to either use more energy or use less energy during the day. Somebody who's down here at minus 20%, they're not going to be there for very long because look how much their metabolic rate has dropped. They have to eat 500 less calories per day just to remain stable. So this is the seminal study here. I'd also like to mention Kevin Hall, who did a Biggest Loser 6-year follow-up study, and he was building a metabolic model that would actually explain this process. He had a spreadsheet, he could plug in all the figures, and it would it would predict the metabolic rate of people based on how much energy that they were eating and what their body fat was. And this is the study. It's actually the Fothergill study. And what he did was he took people who started on The Biggest Loser. Their average. I'm not worried about the error bars here, but this is the mean weight of the people, the 16 people who did The Biggest Loser TV show. They started at 148 kilograms. This is the black line. And we're going down. They went down to 90 kilograms during the show. So that's like 13 weeks of really exercising 23 hours a day, or eating a lettuce leaf, and all this, all the stuff that Gillian Michaels is expert in. And then you'll see that he went back and looked at them 6 years later, and they'd almost gone back up to the same weight. And his prediction for their metabolic rate was 2577 kilocalories down to 2272 kilocalories, and his prediction would be that they would go back up to 2403 kilocalories of energy that they're using during the day because they'd gone back up to this body weight. And he also measured how much exercise they were doing, and his exercise, before the competition, they were doing roughly 5.6 kilocalories of exercise per kilogram of body weight. And at the end of the show, they were doing 10, so they doubled the amount of exercise that they were doing. And then 6 years later, they were roughly around about the same amount of exercise output per kilogram of body weight. Kevin Hall's a very smart man and a very good scientist, and I don't want to be disrespectful of him, but he missed something rather fundamental here. Their body weight is changing. So the actual exercise that they didn't remain stable. The exercise went up. Look at these poor people. This is their body weight had returned back to normal, and their exercise, they were almost double the exercise that they started off in the first place. And you remember what his prediction was? Their metabolic rate would go like this and then back up to there. The actual is their metabolic rate started out at 2600. At the end of the competition, it had dropped to below 2000, and 6 years later, it was 100 kilocalories per day less. So these people now, they basically lost 700 calories a day, less food that they could eat to try and maintain their body weight. So, and they were doing more exercise. You would think, the cameras are off, the competition's no longer there, the $1 million or whatever prize is no longer there. They're all going to eat Krispy Kremes and get off the exercise bike. In fact, they were working even harder down the road. So the interesting thing is that there may be an explanation for that might be better than saying, people who have bigger bodies have a higher metabolic rate. Maybe cellular energy constraints are driving the metabolic adaptation. Maybe the amount of energy that your body is willing to use during the day is based around the amount of energy that your cells have access to. And one prediction for this would be on a low insulinogenic hypocaloric diet, the resting metabolic rate would be higher than on a high insulinogenic hypocaloric diet. So, for example, and the reason why we're talking about insulin here is because we know insulin is affecting both source and sink. And the reason we want to be hypocaloric is because we want to put pressure on the system and we want to see how it perturbs. And there is actually an example of this prediction coming true. David Ludwig's study, the Ebeling study, showed that people on a low-carb diet indeed had a higher metabolic rate than people on a high-carb diet after losing, I think it was 5% of the body weight. It was something in that range. So in summation, I think we should start thinking about fuel as being something different than energy. Thank you. One thing, we're just going to have Caroline Cartier come up, and she's doing a study and she's looking for volunteers to help join her study. So if you could just give her 5 minutes of your attention. And then we have lunch, we have toasted cheese sandwiches and all that happening outside. So, thank you.
you. Thank you for giving me this time. I know we're eager to go eat. As you heard, my name is Carolina Cartier. I am a graduate student at Bastyr University, and I am currently working on a research thesis looking at carbohydrate restriction as a potential treatment for female infertility. And I am hoping to take that on to a PhD program. So why did they let me come up here? The reason is that I'm here to ask for your help in getting my thesis completed. And I'll describe that in a moment. A brief history on my motivation. Why did a former financial analyst change careers to nutrition research? Well, I have a very long history of endocrine disruption. When I was a young child, I was diagnosed with precocious puberty, and then at the age of 13, I was diagnosed with PCOS. I then struggled with the symptoms, as many of you know what those are, for 16 years of complete anovulatory PCOS. So I had no ovulation, no cycle at all. On one day, well, as you can see, my weight did continue to rise. It felt like it was uncontrollable. And in that time, because I had no history of ovulation, I was told I couldn't have children. So I was feeling pretty hopeless in that regard. Eventually stopped even going to physicians because I wasn't getting help. And then one day when I was feeling particularly unwell, tired, hungry, even though I had plenty of energy available, I went to a naturopathic doctor. And thankfully, in her very large panel of blood tests, she tested my fasting insulin. And I discovered for the first time in my life, after 16 years of struggling, that I was severely insulin resistant. Big surprise to a lot of us here. And thankfully, her protocol was to reduce my carbohydrate intake. Having an answer, I said, absolutely, I'll quit cold turkey, and I ran with it. Now, it's been 5 years, and obviously I had some substantial weight loss, but the real miracle is that after only 4 months of carbohydrate restriction, having no history of ovulation at all, I started to ovulate and cycle. Thank you. And a few years later, without any medical assistance of any kind, I conceived twin boys, my fraternal boys, and they will be 2 in November. So my story is not unique, and that's what's so important. So it comes back to how can you help me with my research, and how can you help all the women in your lives who are struggling with this? Chances are almost everyone in here knows someone who struggles with infertility. So I have 2 surveys that I need your help to distribute. One of them is for clinicians only, and they can be low-carb friendly or not. We're looking at their overall perception. And then one is for women who have implemented some form of low-carb or carb restriction, and then they get to tell me all about their results. Okay? So I'm going to be posting all the details of this on my Instagram. It's Keto Babies. I have a Facebook page and a Facebook group, Keto Babies. And then also, if you are a clinician of any kind, a physician or dietitian or anyone who sees patients, and you'd like more information on that clinician survey, you can also email me or contact me through those methods. It's carolina.cartier@bastyr.edu. So that's what I had to share with you. Thank you so much for the time. Thank you, Richard, Daisy, and Kim specifically for helping me get this time. And hopefully we can move the needle on this research, this gap. So thank you very much. I hope you all enjoy your lunch.
Thanks very much. We're on schedule. It's lunchtime now. It was going to be 1:45 when we're coming back, but it would be better if you could come back at around 1:30 so we can start at 1:35, because I think Professor Finney's got a lot to say. So let's be back by 1:30 if we can. Thank you.